We were closer, I think, when we adjourned than we are. Come on up. Richard, we got a few questions for you. Thanks for waiting for us. So you know that we're getting frisky when we take our coats off and loosen our ties. Roll up our sleeves.
Mr. Chairman, could I get a different time then, when you've put your coats back on?
Okay. So this is a callback for AG Hill. A couple different things that we had on our list. One was just to get a little bit better description of the firing range request and all that entails.
And I went up and visited, and went and visited the academy and had them show me the ranges. There's 3 of them. So yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, for this, I've brought Director Chuck Bang, our director of the Law Enforcement Academy, who is the individual who has been working with construction management and knows all about that building and the wonderful work that they've done to try to extend the life of that building, and they really have. But some of it just simply needs repaired now, and he could explain the 3 firing ranges to you if that's acceptable.
So I'm wondering if we can put another $5 surcharge in all court filings and fines so we can pay for this.
Mr. Chairman, I don't object. I don't know if other folks object to that.
All right, welcome. Why don't you give us an update, and if you have materials that we can look at, or we can, some of us kind of want to read the studies that were done and that kind of stuff. So go ahead, please.
Again, Chuck Bain, the director of the Law Enforcement Academy. Chairman Nichols, co-chair Senator Perkins. I'm sorry I missed your visit. I was home with strep throat and the antibiotics hadn't kicked in.
Well, thank you for
yet.
not coming.
So I thought I'd better stay home. But they did inform me of your visit, and thank you for coming. And I know that there's been a number of members of the committee that have been through there. To further explain our requests for some of the work on the firearms ranges. We are coming up almost on 40 years of that academy being built. And some of you may be familiar with some of the issues that we've had over the years in regards to the soil conditions and the movement of the building, asphalt, other components of our facility, and the firearms ranges are no different. And essentially what we're trying to do are 3 things related to the firearms ranges. We have an outdoor firearms range that right now allows us for it to use 20 students at a time to a maximum distance of 50 yards. That's what we call our outdoor pistol range. In 1983, when the facility was opened, we also utilized that for our shotgun training because 50 yards was about the maximum that we were going to utilize for that tool. Over the years, the target system that we utilize that turns the targets for us, that is part of our training, is failing. The manufacturer doesn't exist anymore. We've gone from 4 motors turning those targets to 1. We hope that when it finally fails, it fails in the front facing position rather than to the edge facing position. So we could at least still utilize some of that, but we're crossing our fingers. That range really needs to be expanded to 25 stations. And the reason for that is that we are seeing an increase in our applications for basic training. Currently, we limit them to 36 students. In the wintertime, we can go to 40 students in the summertime, and we have 2 relays, 20 students at a time, and we're much more efficient at utilizing our ranges. When we start going beyond 40 students, now we add a 3rd relay, so it cuts our training time by 2/3, that we are able to allow those students time to utilize that ammunition and practice and use that. So we really need to expand that to that 25 so we could begin having more students per class and be responsive to the agencies as they're sending students to our training. So it's an.
Go ahead, please.
If I may ask a question, when you talk about students, are these individuals already employed with different agencies around the state that they're just coming back for some more instruction? Or are these new kind of cadets or entry into the program?
Senator Hicks, Co-Chairman Nicholas, Co-Chairman Perkins, they are a combination of all of that. Our primary responsibility at the academy is training what we would term recruits or basic students. So they have to complete that basic training academy, both detention officers and peace officers, and they have different curriculums and spend different times with us. But we also then provide a number of training courses for advanced training in firearms, and then especially firearms instructors. We actually certify those instructors for the agencies so that they can be more self-sufficient in training their officers back at their agencies. So it's a combination of both of those. That basic student coming in, that some of them have no experience with firearms whatsoever, and then that advanced training, and then those instructors that we certify initially, and then they come back every 2 years for recertification.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. When I was tracking this nationwide, the number of recruits and people going into law enforcement are dramatically down. Are we seeing the same trend here or not?
Surprisingly, we are not seeing that trend as bad as I've had reports from across the country. For an example, while it whittled itself down, I have a detention officer basic class in session right now. We started last Monday. Prior to the end of the year, we had 43 applications for that. Right now, as it whittled down and they didn't get backgrounds done, and we sent some home that didn't meet the physical fitness requirements the first day, we're to 25. So we're seeing some relatively decent numbers for Wyoming agencies. And an interesting point with that, Senator Hicks, is we recently completed a class that we call criminal law and procedures. So those are for trained certified officers coming from other states, and they need certification and training here in Wyoming. That class number, the last group that we trained, far exceeded the basic class that we had. So we're seeing agencies take advantage of those officers that are trained out of state that are now relocating to Wyoming for a variety of reasons. But so we're seeing some of those numbers increase far and above what we've had in the past. To continue the outdoor range, again, we need to expand that. We need to add 5 more target lanes. To do that, it's going to require a lot of earth movement. It's going to require some concrete retaining walls to help maintain and leave that soil where it needs to be.
If I can interject,
Please,
Mr. And just the outdoor range has been there a long time. It's just their soil berms and erosion has taken its toll over time. So even if you weren't expanding, there's some significant work needs to be done in the outdoor range just to make sure that it doesn't fall in on itself to some degree. I mean, the dirt berms and the snow and the rain and everything that's migrating downhill right now, all they've got, I think they're railroad ties.
That's correct.
Into the sides of those now. And it's been that way for a long time. And even if you weren't going to expand it, it still needs some work.
Senator Perkins, that's correct. So now is the perfect time to do that as we need to address some of those other issues and things. Now is the better time to expand that to allow us to continue that mission. One of the other interesting things about that target system that I was telling you about, it's controlled by an operator in the tower that's up, and it's an elevated position. About a year ago, we had some problems with that target system, and they came in and had to rebuild the controller. Some things didn't get done right, and nobody was in there, but we were scoring the targets, and those things automatically turned, hit one of the instructors in the knee, took him out, and he was out 2 days in sick leave because of the injury and a hip bruise for those things. So now we have to turn it off at the breaker in order to make sure that we're not injuring people. So it's just those kind of things that we need to address in that area. If I could move on, then, as I mentioned earlier, that range was sufficient at its time. to help us do our shotgun training. And police shotgun had been around for a number of years, and it was the staple of a long gun. That is no longer the case. Law enforcement agencies now are using what they call patrol rifles. The most common caliber is a .223. Game and Fish is using a .308, but they're finding that it has greater control. And the shotgun has now turned into a specialty weapon to use as a breaching tool to use specialized rounds, beanbag rounds, and those things. So the effective range of that tool for law enforcement agencies is 300 yards. I don't have 300 yards shooting capacity on the grounds of the law enforcement academy. The most we have is 100 yards. We have cabbaged onto part of our track, or the big flat 5-acre asphalt surface that we train officers to use emergency vehicles. And we have a 100-yard range that we've kind of made some temporary target stands, if you will, to do that. I can, if we want to make it diagonally and get about 300 yards. The problem is the backstop then is on the neighbor's property. It's not on the property of the academy. So we're rather concerned, as well as the neighbor is, and their horses say, well, that's not really a good idea to be doing that. So part of this request is to develop that 300-yard capacity at the academy itself. So we're able then to train that tool effectively and send those officers, especially those officers of basic training, back to their agencies, better functioning at the distances that tool is effective for and designed for, rather than just, at the 100-yard mark.
Mr. Chairman, the long range, it really is. If you think of the parking lot at Albertsons out on Yellowstone, and they park their cars over here and they go over here and they shoot back across the parking lot. That's what they're doing now for that. And it's interesting. Probably it's getting a bigger deal. I noticed that there's some subdivisions out there behind in the distance, and there's some other issues out there as Douglas has grown, I think, that are causing probably some concern. In fact, is it Brian? So Brian's house is back over there, and so actually shoot at Brian's house. If somebody aims high, it might actually hit Brian's house, which is his own house, private house in a newer subdivision that's built off to a little bit to the west a little bit, I think. Yeah.
Chairman Perkins, 40 years ago, we didn't have to worry about those things. We were kind of out on the outskirts of town, but we've been surrounded more. So there are some complaints and some concerns related to noise. So we have to think about how do we engineer these and how do we have some baffle systems that are put in to help control those things and be a good neighbor.
Then if that happened, the AG would probably have to declare conflict, and we'd have to get outside attorney to come in and represent everyone to take on the problem.
And 50 million might not, 37 million might not be enough in that liability fund, a risk management fund.
We would represent ourselves, Mr. Chairman, even though they say only a fool does that.
Well, just to put your mind at ease, as becoming the director, one of the first things I said, we're not going to do this 300-yard thing. We're going to take care of the neighbors. We're going to minimize those things. So we're back doing what we can at that 100-yard range. The last request that you see, and it's actually part of the State Building Commission, they kind of combined a number of the level 1 requests, I believe. I think that was the number 2 request they had. But part of that is then doing a level 1 regarding the expansion of our indoor range. Our indoor range is 12 lanes at 25 yards. So if you think about trying to get 40 students in shooting, at 36 students, that's why we limit them. Now you're at 3 relays. And it begins to slow the training down, and they have less opportunity and time utilizing that tool. So that level 1 is to look at and explore what the cost would be to expand that indoor range to a 25-lane, 50-yard facility that then we wouldn't have to worry much about 9 below temperatures like we did last week of where those students are and how they begin training. The reality is law enforcement officers could find themselves in a deadly force situation when it was 9 degrees or 9 below out there. That's true. But when you're teaching people and that's just their first opportunity utilizing those firearms, you like it to be in a much better condition. So you have greater learning taking place in that short period of time, rather than putting that exposure to those elements when they're just starting out and beginning to learn.
Mr. Chairman.
And on the indoor range, they have the ability to just expand sideways. They don't have to, it's not like we were talking about the other day, to put in a shelf, you have to move. There was a, it's not like you have to move this, and then you have to move the bathrooms, and then you have to move the gymnasium. You can just, it can just expand out to the side, replace the, and just expand there. Because all they have to the one side, a little bit of storage. So you just move that out, move the storage out. It really is going to be the most efficient way to do that. Plus, then, like as you're talking about, all the indoor stuff needs to be updated as well. But
That's
those are my observations.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I had a question on the indoor firing range. It sounded like you were asking for funds for a level 1 study for a 50-yard indoor firing range. And I appreciate the level 1 study that we were provided, but it looked like that study discussed a 50-yard indoor firing range already. So, and as well as a lot of other things like a high-speed racetrack, which sounded like a lot of fun. But do you need, what more studying do you need to do for an indoor? Is this level 2 that you want to do on the indoor range, or what else needs to be done?
Co-Chairman Nicholas, Co-Chairman Perkins, Representative Stith. This is a little bit different in that study that was commissioned by the State Building Commission that you have there and referred to. That suggestion was to build a standalone building for firearms training that was the 50 yards by 25 yard. So that came with its own separate cost. What we're looking at is given that State Building Commission was really rather hesitant to do much with this study and spend the money that it was suggested to spend, what we're looking at is what could we then do to expand what we already have. So in that level 1 that they did was the recommendation of a new facility, a new building. We're taking that and say, well, what would it be to do a cost to use the existing facility?
And Mr. Chairman, you also might explain on it was method. It's a huge number, but it was a little bit eye-opening when the request came in on changing the locks and security. And then I went out and had some visits with the locks. You might explain some of the issues you've got with the locking mechanisms and the security that you have on the existing door locks, and why there's that requirement on the locks.
Chairman Perkins, Chairman Nicholas, yeah, it's an interesting environment. Understand that these are the original locks from the building that's nearly 40 years old. Again, the parts aren't being made anymore. You can't find the same system, if it were, so if you would change one out, that key is not going to work in the other systems. If you cut a new key, it doesn't work in the old locks because the tumbler mechanisms and the pins are just worn out. So we have, they probably showed you, Senator Perkins, that I can go around the facility with my master key, pull out cylinders from the doors and put in my pocket that they absolutely fall out and you can't keep them in the door. So when we did this level 1 study with that the State Building Commission wanted us to do, they were very surprised that we were still utilizing the same original lock system. Now, remember, over these years, we've lost keys, even though the students have paid for them and we've managed to keep the blanks in there. The reality is there are several dozen keys out there to that building that are floating around somewhere in the state. And so it just makes sense, again, that to move to a system that is a little bit more contemporary, that we have the capabilities to expand and utilize the technology that's available now to replace these failing systems so that we can continue to secure the building and grant access as we need to.
And the ammo lockers.
I'm sorry?
And the ammo lockers.
Yes.
And the
Yeah.
firearm lockers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if there's no further questions.
Well, yeah, I'm just kind of fill out what's, because I don't have the documents in front of me. What's the ask? What do you need right away? And at some point, when are you going to need to relocate? And does it make sense to relocate versus continuing to upgrade or to expand the current location? I mean, I presume you kind of been through that thought process.
Co-Chairman Nicholas, yeah, that's the $65,000 question here. In that, I know that this study being done by the State Building Commission was as the result of a number of years of going before them saying we have these issues and we need the asphalt being one of those. We spent $2 million in 2008 to refinish the asphalt and do repairs. We just got done doing another $230,000. And that's just a Band-Aid. In another 3 to 5 years, we're coming back again. And so they were asking the same question, what really needs to be done? This study that you have that Representative Stiff referred to, I thought was very well done and very comprehensive. And they spent a lot of time with my staff to look at not only what's the facility needs, but what does it need programmatically to do your job and to do the training of law enforcement officers. Their best recommendation was you need a new facility. You've outgrown what you have and it needs to be, expanded. And that had the best advantage. Of course, it came with a $66 million price tag. The next best was stay where you are, buy adjacent property so you could expand the fun track, as Representative Stiff talked about, and do that training, because we don't do any of that right now. It's a large gap in what's being done in law enforcement training in the state of Wyoming. But if you can get adjacent land and then expand, that was $60 million. To try to do anything else and stay where you are in the footprint because of the terrain, because of the limitations of the property, there wasn't much that the experts looked at that said you're going to be able to salvage. So, it comes to that point that we'll carry on the best that we can, trying to piecemeal, for lack of a better term, the things that need to be done right away. But ultimately, that's some of these issues that we've been talking about for the last couple of years with it are still going to remain.
Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, to answer your question, the 3 projects are requesting add up to just over $2.9 million.
So yeah, the question is, do we spend 3 million or do we put that in a pot to start building you a new building?
I think he was probably going to say, we're not sure, but I'll let him answer. And then I'll tell you, we thought from our perspective, Mr. Chairman, that to some extent there were policy considerations that we couldn't decide for ourselves. And those mostly related to, where do you think the law enforcement academy for the whole state should be located? It was our belief that policy considerations, including those of the legislature and executive branch, thought that bit should be somewhat centrally located, which meant Douglas. But our opportunities to build a whole new facility in Douglas seemed somewhat limited. And so we hadn't come to some sort of resolution of where we thought the facility in general should be located. And we're looking for more policy, I guess, input to say where we thought that should be. It was our understanding originally you choose Douglas because it's somewhat centrally located within the state of
So,
Wyoming.
Just to follow up on that, Bridget, so you've looked at other grounds and properties in the near vicinity and there's not much there. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chairman, that is my understanding. Chuck has, again, been working with construction management more fully than I have. And so if he could add details to that, I would let him, if that's acceptable to you.
Well, go ahead, Chuck.
I could add details to that, Chairman Nicholas, that we started to go down that path and we had identified some specific areas around Douglas and had just begun some discussions related to that. And then during that State Building Commission meeting, And it was just decided that this was not anything that was going to be acted upon at that point. Those kinds of efforts stopped at that point. So we began to look at and had some ideas with it, but that's as far as it got.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but you know, even if you choose Plan B, building a new facility someplace or there, it appears you're still going to need to do some corrections or some improvements to be able to bridge that gap, are you not?
Representative Larson, Co-Chairman Nicholas, Co-Chairman Perkins, that's exactly right. These are stopgap measures to keep us functioning and doing what we need to continue to do.
Well, let's just follow up on that. If we gave you $1 million and not $3 million for stopgap measures, what would you do? What's the most important?
Most important is I would take on my outdoor range that desperately needs to be repaired and fixed to get that back and functional and go from there. And the second thing I would do is then the security of the facility is going to be paramount. So training's got to come first. And that if that was my choice, that's what I do today.
Further questions? Okay, appreciate it.
Thank you.
So have you brought this to the judiciary? I'm trying, who's your reporting committee? Is judiciary other than not for Capcom?
Mr. Chairman, we report to the judiciary.
Okay.
Because this was through construction management, we didn't take it to judiciary. We were expecting the construction management process to be
Well,
the
it's probably
process.
a good idea because what you need to do is build up momentum for votes. So you got to educate as many legislators as you can. So I would suggest you do it at the next opportunity at the judiciary meeting. I think it's just educational and it's useful.
Okay.
Okay.
So that, I don't have any more questions about the academy. I think that was one thing.
Right. Yeah, a couple more on the list. Okay, next on our list is, let me find my list. So we've had different discussions, Bridget, about over the course of the last couple of months, and mainly because of costs and cost overruns of the how the state handles capital cases and the costs of them, and wondering if there are different ways that we can either statutorily address this issue. Right now, you know, the state pays both sides of the bill, basically. And we're just wondering what your philosophy is in terms of capital cases and having qualified expertise to try them on both sides, and the cost to you, the cost to the state, and how do you handle them, and do you have any ideas on how we can do it better?
Mr. Chairman, if I can add into that particular question, just which is just another one's just a dollar question. That was, so, you know, we had the public defender come, and so the public defender has a budget request for roughly $1 million in case there's a capital case that, you know, develops. And so the $1 million for the defense side, we had 2 district attorneys and the county attorneys all applied. Nobody has made any request for any amount of money aside to handle the prosecution side of a capital case. And so, you know, you look at that, that's another decision we have to make is ultimately if there, and I just, there one capital case pending now, or one case that is considered to be capital. I don't know if they made up their mind
There was
yet.
threats of it, right?
So, but anyway, that was the other thing. I mean, from the prosecution side, there appear to be no resource requests in this budget for to assist the prosecution in deferring costs, the extreme costs that the capital murder cases take. So anyway, we just wanted to bring that to your attention and see that, and then the other things that my co-chairman asked.
All right, Mr. Co-Chairman, I'll start first of all with the cost to my office. The cost to my office is already assumed in the cost of my attorneys. So capital cases to us don't cost, I would say 99% of capital cases don't cost the AG's office any more than any other cost, because our cost is tied up in our attorney time. And so it would be attorney time working on the direct appeal, any post-conviction relief, state post-conviction relief, and then in any federal habeas. And so that is taken care of just with my attorney time. I don't really have external costs related to that. The one note I would make would be sometimes in federal habeas actions, you would have to hire an expert, usually in the mental health field, if we were going to talk about the mental capacity of the person. But the one time we had to use that in the past, we were able to use an expert from the state hospital, and that did not cost us anything. So the cost to me for a capital case is already within my budget and my attorney time. Now, I will make the point that the last capital case that we worked on, we did have to assign 4 attorneys. So they are a big deal in terms of they do use my attorney time, and they do make my attorneys' availability for other cases kind of tight. But we are able to handle that within our budget and within our attorneys. So that's why you don't see those costs from us.
And so, and I think we understand that. And Bridget, what I was remembering was from a prior stint on appropriations. One of the ways we handled that was, it doesn't necessarily cost your office, but it's a heavy cost to the main prosecution office, whether it's a county attorney, or whether it's one of the district attorneys. And so what we had done before is we had parked money in your office so that you could allocate that to assist on the prosecution side. And so, like I say, there's no requests of that that are anywhere in the budget that I believe that are there. So I don't know what your feelings are about that. So,
Mr. Chairman, so I was going to move on to next. So there is an account that if there's, and it's not just death penalty cases, but if you had extremely challenging cases or complicated cases, you could come to us and ask for additional money, and that would be prosecutors. And I think $100,000 sits in that account for us. Let me just make sure Steve's going to give me the nod that I gave you the right number. I gave you a significantly wrong number. I'm sorry. That got cut down from 100,000 to 15,000. So there's only $15,000. Significantly wrong. 15. And so
Spend that's an 85.
that'd be taken quickly. But in terms of our district attorneys and our county attorneys, you're right. We haven't seen that from district attorneys, a specific line item in their budgets. I went and looked at that before we got here. I think they used to have that in the past, but they haven't pursued capital cases. And I think through budget cuts over time, that's one of the items that they saw to line out, thinking that if they decided to charge a capital case, they could sort that out some other way. Now, our county attorneys, of course, to some extent are funded through their county. And so I don't know what their budget ramifications are there. But I think to go along with that, what I would note is some of the difference you've seen between the public defender and the prosecution side is it is the prosecution who gets to decide, right? To some extent, public defenders are subject to whatever the prosecution decides. So it makes sense that they have to have that money there. Whereas, and I don't know if county or district attorneys do that, they control what they charge. I would say the general census or consensus from those folks is, and we did talk to them a little bit, and is they do think capital cases are an important tool to have, or the ability to charge a capital case. And there may be some instances where the case fits the statutory factors that the legislature itself has laid out. And the ones I think that they would point to in particular would be ones where there is otherwise probably no punishment for the person for committing a murder. And that would be somebody already serving a life sentence who murders somebody in prison. If that takes place and you don't have a capital punishment available, to some extent that person escapes punishment because they're already in prison without the possibility of parole. It also becomes a useful tool and maybe an efficient tool for the prosecutors, at least in terms of pleading cases. If you take the death penalty off the table, is somebody willing to plead to a capital or a first degree murder that they otherwise would not be willing to enter a plea agreement with? And so from that perspective, I do think prosecutors in our state, and it is our local prosecutors who prosecute those cases, see it as an important tool. And that makes sense. But what your first question was, the reason it becomes a problem for the public defender's office is they have to, probably to meet their ethical obligations, if capital punishment is available or a possibility, if capital punishment is a possibility, they have to put capital case qualified attorneys on it from the start. And then it might not ultimately get charged as a capital case. And then you have that expense there. So they have to start preparing initially from the get-go from those cases, because we don't actually have that many charged in the state. I did ask some of our county attorneys, and we had some of them respond that they only have sought it one time. We have some responding that they considered it one time, strongly considered it, but then through their own assessment decided it didn't meet the statutory criteria. We have it considered a couple times, but I had very few. I had some attorneys saying they hadn't seen an appropriate case they thought to charge a capital case. So I don't think there's a lot of it going on, but from the public defender's perspective, they, if it's a possibility, have to be prepared from that from the start. And that's where you see some of the additional expense for them. So you're asking me, what do I think that could solve that? I don't have good ideas of how to solve that since I'm not charging those cases. One thing would be if you could figure out, though, how to address the problem I last talked about. If you could add some certainty to folks in terms of when you're going to charge a capital case, could you let it be known as soon as possible? Could you, so the public defender's office isn't immediately looking for capital case qualified personnel to put on it and start preparing that way if that's ultimately not what's going to happen there. That's maybe something that I think could help with the cost.
Well, one of the things that could help with the cost for the state is we could require the counties where it's prosecuted to pay for the defense costs. Because if they bring it, then it would make sense perhaps that they should at least pay part of that bill instead of the state paying.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, the problem I see with that, though, is, you know, if you think about what's getting charged in crimes, they're getting charged in the name of the state, right? And it is to some extent, we wanted to keep the choices closest to the folks, but that's why we have DAs too, right? Because they're getting charged in the name of the state, and that it is a state interest. And so I wonder where that would
but it's also
put
a state
you.
interest not to pay $10 million for defense fees. So it's a balance.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would agree. That's a policy consideration that you all would think about in your, whether you want capital cases to continue or not. Again, I just think there are some valid policy reasons you might want to, and they are the ones that I have suggested.
Go ahead.
Not trying to hide my sentiment about capital cases, but when was the last time there was a homicide in the Department of Corrections system?
It was Mr. Chairman, Representative Swartz. I'm gonna not remember the exact year, but it was early 2000s. That would have been the Harlow case where they murdered a guard in the prison. So early 2000.
And I argued the habeas on that case.
There we go. So it was early 2000s, if you recall. I can't remember the exact.
Judge Brimmer, not a chance.
I mean, if it's been a long time since we've executed anybody and we don't have anybody sitting on death row currently.
Had to wake him up. So just moving on there, another question we had is there's approximately, I think, 8 million, a little under $8 million left of CARES Act dollars that were directed to recipients in the state of Wyoming that didn't qualify. And so they asked for the money back, but it hasn't been paid back. Just tell us what your plan is, or how do you about getting the money back?
Mr. Chairman, we are working on those right now. So Business Council obviously conducted an audit, and there were found to be, I think approximately, I'm going to give you approximate numbers here, 50 businesses that seemingly did not spend their funds appropriately. So Business Council started and asked them for that money back. Some people did send the money back. Those that didn't got sent to our office to see what we could do. Our initial step would be the same as any step we take in trying to collect debt, which is first to send them a demand letter and demand they pay it back.
How many
And
demand letters have you sent?
I believe we sent around at this, well, we would have sent letters to all those that didn't get response from Wyoming Business Council. So I believe that number to be around 30 businesses that we sent letters to. Some of them responded. And some of them responded with additional information. It's important to note in the audit, some of it was, we just don't have enough documentation to determine whether you use your monies appropriately or not. Some responded with additional documentation. And so we, for lack of a better term, cleared them off. Some responded and said they would owe money back, but they couldn't pay it all back. And so those folks were put on a payment plan to pay that money over time. And we've got some folks in that situation. Others, of course, responded and said, we don't owe those, or we got no response at all. So for those folks, ultimately, our plan has to be that we would have to, same as any other debt collection, you would have to litigate with them, sue them to get that money back. Once you have that judgment, then figure out how to execute on that judgment, which is probably also through the court system. Now, it's important to keep in mind too, some of these numbers were pretty small. Some folks only found $3,000. Those amounts were pretty small. We did have 4 businesses needing to return more than $200,000. So we've got some bigger ones out there that we will work for, but our plan would be to pursue them as we do all uncollectible amounts owed to our clients.
Yeah, I presume honestly with this particular dollars, the longer you wait, the less likely you'll collect.
Mr. Chairman, I think that is correct. And so we don't intend to dilly-dally if that's what you're suggesting, in part because of the time limitations. Those are federal dollars that we'll owe back. And so we'll have to work on those. You know, if there are smaller amounts that can be settled through something less than litigation, we would consider that an option as well.
So, Bridget, my assessment as I watched through that, and I think your office is really handling this well, but most of the folks that got these CARE Act monies had exhausted their traditional means of securing finances to keep their business going previous to applying for the CARES Act money. So I think we were not in a good position to begin with. Does your office have a similar sentiment or?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I will note the unique thing about these CARES Act dollars and CARES Act programs. There were kind of competing interests in terms of the CARES Act came seemingly with a mandate to get those dollars out quickly, right? Get those out so you could keep businesses open and keep them functioning. And so that came with a big push, get those out, get those out. So programs had to be set up quickly. The requirements that went along with those programs were done very quickly. At the same time, they came with the federal government saying, if you spend those incorrectly, we're gonna want them back. And so I think that's why you see as many as you did, although I will say Wyoming had a relatively small problem compared to even the federal government itself in terms of the fraud that they saw in those programs. And so there were those competing interests. And so to some extent, that's why we started with the letter of, if you have documentation that could show you spent it for an appropriate purpose, please send it to us. Because I do think to some extent, folks didn't have another remedy and they didn't fully understand. So would we take that in? I think what you're asking me though, is would we take that into account as we're proceeding? I think we would, but of course our obligation is obviously to protect federal funds because they will come back to the state if we didn't spend those appropriately. So we've got to protect the state ultimately.
So any further questions?
Not about that. I do have one other.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I've kind of lost track, Bridget. I mean, between on the different cases on the mandates and which circuit we're in and which ones have been stayed and which ones haven't been stayed. I've kind of lost track. Can you give us a quick rundown on where we're at as far as our litigations and which federal orders are enforceable or
Yeah,
which aren't at this point?
Mr. Chairman, I only giggle because we've got 4 going. And so I lose track of what circuit we're in on a regular basis as well. But interestingly enough, the very last thing on our OSHA and our CMS was they were in front of the US Supreme Court right before I came up here. And I was,
Come out with something.
they did come out with something and I was unable to read them. So I'm not going to be able to tell you about them because it was literally as I'm about to walk up here. It appears we won OSHA 6-3, meaning that the US Supreme Court said the stay was appropriate because we had a likelihood of success on the merit, which means I believe we're in a really good spot when it comes to the OSHA.
So that's just the stay. That's one thing. Okay.
They didn't hear the merits, but of course, for a stay, one of the factors is you have to have a likelihood of success on the merits, and they said we had it, I believe, because again, I didn't read it. This is the report I got. CMS, we did not win. That was a 5-4 decision. They said there was not a likelihood of success on the merits based on how that argument went on Friday. I listened to the Supreme Court argument. My guess is, and you can't hold me to it because again, it's a guess, I didn't read it, would be they did say that CMS has the authority to order those vaccine mandates because it is their money that they're using to pay Medicare and Medicaid. So I'll go back and read that, but it doesn't look hopeful on CMS. So that's your healthcare workers, folks. That one, we did not get the stay. And so they can continue enforcing that regulation on healthcare workers. Our federal contractor one, we're in a group of states that has a stay in the federal contractor one. And that was at our district court level there in the 8th Circuit. And so we haven't seen that one appealed yet. But the interesting thing to note on the federal contractor one is the coalition that is in the 6th Circuit. So that would be your Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They're a little bit ahead of us in terms of their litigation. And I think they're about to go to their circuit court. So you might hear something out of them and they would beat us probably to the US Supreme Court because we're still sitting in our district court. But we do have a stay for Wyoming and our coalition of states in our federal contractor one. Then After we spoke last time about that, we did get into another case that had a vaccine mandate. That would have been Head Start. They were ordering the folks in Head Start programs to get vaccines, and what we are calling a toddler mask mandate, that children as young as 2 would have to wear a mask. And we are in that case. And that's down in Louisiana, a district court down in Louisiana. And we do have a stay in that case as well. So that's where we are. It gets confusing, but I'm excited to read what the court wrote. I just haven't done it yet. It literally came out right before I came up here.
Thank you.
So just to follow up on your staffing, how has that come along since we last talked? At the same level?
Mr. Chairman, I would say same level because I think I hired one, but I lost another one this week. So
By
Our-
retirement or moving on?
moving on for better pay. One of our litigators, and those are hard to lose. So we are in a little bit of pickle in terms of vacancies. So again, I would say anything you can do to help with salaries. I do think it's mostly salary driven. We sure would appreciate. Yeah, any attorneys on the committee, if you're looking for a new gig, I have some vacancies and I would love to have you on board.
Okay, any further questions for Bridget? Thank you very much for coming back.
Thank you very
Appreciate your
much.
Service and
Thank you.
hard work. Thanks. Okay, we're moving on to I just sent Jillian, well, I'm drafting an email because she just sent us the Okay, we're on going to bills. First one up, local government distributions. Don, walk us through the bill, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Don Richards, Budget and Fiscal Administrator. I'm before you to speak on 22 LSO 0322 Working Draft 0.3. There are two associated handouts with that, handout number 191 and 192. For those of you who are on the electronic system, for those of you who are using the hard copy, the first one is a two-page handout that looks like a flow chart, and the second one is a landscaped page summary with each of the municipalities and counties, and I will use that in my presentation. I will admit I'm a bit rusty on this. The last time I appeared before the committee, I believe, on local government distributions was 2005. So a few things have changed. Mr. Chairman, the local government distribution actually commenced in the 2005-2006 biennium. The amount has changed over time. I'll just read through those briefly. We started at about 91 million, and in the 7-8 biennium during the boom, it increased to 168 million before falling back to the $145 million range in 9-10. 11-12, it dipped further to 97.5 million. 13-14 was 101 million. 15-16, 113 million. And for the last three biennia and currently, it has been established at $105 million, a fairly stable amount. And that is the amount that is in the bill draft before you, as well as the governor's profile that he submitted on
Mr. Chairman,
mid-November. Go ahead.
Don, the exhibits, where would they be found in SharePoint? Thank you.
Moving to, and I will reference the handouts, but I'll begin by walking through the bill. And I believe the 1920 biennium, the Revenue Committee substantively changed the method.
It's like a nursery. You can't leave the computer alone for just a second. It just, you know what kind of trouble it's going to get in.
I think
They were back.
Mr. Chairman, and I will try to speak a little bit louder as we appear to have, I don't hear that echo, so we may have some mic issues. On section 1, subsection A, this establishes the amount, the $105 million. On the top of page 2, paragraph I, Romanet I, makes the first split between municipalities and counties. And it basically splits 2/3 of 89% to cities and towns. And then if you drop down to paragraph Romanet 2, it is 1/3 of 89% is directed to counties. Well, what happened to the other 11%? And that is distributed equally in 5.5% increments. Half of 11%, or 5.5%, goes to cities and towns, as illustrated at the bottom of page 2 in paragraph 3. And at the top of page 3, paragraph 4, distributes another flat amount to the counties of 5.5%. Now, what does that all mean? That is illustrated in the flow chart. It means that the municipal distribution receives 64.83%, and the county distribution receives 35.17%. The point being is it's not quite an equal 1/3, 2/3 because of that 5.5% flat amount to both entities. Subsection B, which begins on the top of page 3, is the distribution for municipalities, including cities and towns. The introductory paragraph indicates that half of the amount is distributed in the first fiscal year and half in the second fiscal year. So that $105 million is a biennial amount. Further, beginning on line 13, page 3, the distributions in each fiscal year are further subdivided into 2 payments. The first payment being made on August 15th and the second payment being made on January 15th. All, just historically speaking, the local government payments previously were all made in August. And the introduction of the January 15th candidly was to assist in the state's cash flow somewhat as much as anything else. The beginning of the formula for the distribution for municipalities begins at the bottom of page 3 in paragraph Romanet I on line 18. And it's quite frankly a little bit easier to see on page 2 of the flow chart, which has the municipal distribution. Paragraph I provides for a base or flat distribution amount to all municipalities with a population of 35 or less. In truth, I believe there's only 2, Van Tassel and Lost Springs, qualify for that base amount of $15,000. Then everyone else, all other cities and towns, receive a flat amount of $35,000. This component of the formula assists the lower populated municipalities more because everyone is getting the same base amount. The next step on the top of page 4, subparagraph A, looks at the most recent per capita sales and use tax and identifies the amount attributable to each municipality. And that at the top of page 5, there's a calculation of an inverse of that per capita sales and use tax. The purpose of the inverse calculation, again, is to assist those municipalities that have the least capability to generate revenues. And then paragraph C is normalized. So you'll see this methodology repeated 4 times in this bill. Per capita amount, take the inverse, and then normalize it, meaning identify the percentage share so it adds up to 100%. That's just the use of the term normalized. Then the 4th step is to weight that in the municipalities. Sales and use taxes, because that's their primary source of income, is weighted at 75%, and property taxes or ad valorem are weighted at 25%. And essentially the reverse is true when we get to the counties. At the bottom of page 5, subparagraph E, F, and G do the same calculation, except this time rather than sales and use tax, we're looking at property taxes or ad valorem taxes. And then H is the multiplier, or multiplying it by 25%. Finally, all of this sales and use tax and the normalized ad valorem tax is multiplied by each city and town population to identify a normalized total number, and then the proportional amount of the appropriation remaining after that base amount was distributed is distributed to all of the municipalities. Finally, there is a subdivision, and that's on the right-hand side of the flow chart. It's titled there the hardship distribution. In the language of the bill, the technical term is the revenue challenged municipalities. And for this, the municipalities with the lowest quartile, amount of cities and towns for the per capita basis are identified, and a special distribution is given to those entities that are below the lowest quartile in order to bring them up to the per capita amount of the lowest quartile. So that's kind of bringing everyone up to the lowest quartile. Mr. Chairman, if there's insufficient funds to bring everyone up, those funds are distributed on a proportional or pro rata basis. The county distribution begins on the middle part of page 9 with subsection C. And it starts off exactly the same way. There are 2 payments for each fiscal year, one in August, one in January. Then I'm proceed to the top of page 10. And any county that has insufficient property tax or assessed valuation to generate at least $300,000 per mill gets a base distribution, and the formula or the flow chart for that appears on page 3 of the handout.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so Don, there's no smoothing here. I mean, if they collect $300,001, they're out.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. There are 9 counties that qualify for this. And I'll read those off. It's big in alphabetical order: Bighorn, Crook, Goshen, Hot Springs, Johnson, Niobrara, Platte, Washakie, and Weston. Those are the 9 of the 23 counties that are determined to be small assessed value adjustment counties. Absolutely. Bighorn, Crook, Goshen, Hot Springs, Johnson, Niobrara, Platte, Washakie, and Weston. And if those, in the case of those 3 counties, 1 mill was less than $300,000, the amount necessary to bring the value of 1 mill up to $300,000 is determined, and then it is multiplied by 3. So there is essentially a hardship or subsidy for those counties up to 3 mills. Now that's only 1/4 of the total 12 mills that they could, and almost all counties do impose, but they get that subsidy to bring them up to 300,000 for 3 mills. Of the pot, this takes about 1/6 of the total pot for counties each year. And on the flow chart, it shows 2.982 million. That amount actually changes each year. It's whatever it takes. So some years it's lower, some years it's higher. And unfortunately, this year, I did not update that number, and it has grown to $3.2 million for the small assessed value adjustment. So I will make that adjustment on the handout online. 3.2 million would be the small assessed value, and then the difference between that and 18.46 million, which equals 15.2. It's basically a $200,000, maybe a little more than $200,000 change in the most recent calculation. And keep in mind, that calculation changes all the time. Even when we leave, if you adopt the bill as is, these are still based on estimates. So the OSLI actually makes these payments, and in the summer, some of this information is updated.
Please.
Don, could you help me again understand just a little bit on the deficit on the 300,000 per meal? I had understood when you were speaking that I thought that they took one of the meals, and if it didn't reach 300,000, they made up the difference. And do they do that for each meal? Okay, so
Each meal, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, up to 3. So they just take that number, multiply by 3.
okay, okay. So they don't. Okay, very good. I've got it.
Then moving to the right-hand side of that flow chart, there's the proportional distribution, which is almost identical to the cities and towns proportional distribution. The only difference is the weighting is almost reversed. Recall it was 75% sales and use tax for the municipalities and 25% ad valorem. And as you can see on the flow chart, it's reversed with a little adjustment because it can't be exact. 24% sales and use tax and 76% assessed value. So if you work through the formulas at the bottom of page 10 and all of page 11 is that per capita sales and use tax for counties. Take the inverse of it on line 4, normalize it on line 8, and then multiply it by their weighting factor on line 15 or subdivision or paragraph subdivision, excuse me, D. Then the same formula is reproduced for assessed value on the bottom of page 11. And then the top of page 12, you calculate the per capita amount of assessed valuation, prepare the inverse, normalize that, and then multiply it by a weighting factor, in this case, 75%, because the primary source of revenue for counties is assessed valuation or property taxes. In paragraph J, excuse me, subdivision J, this was a regression that is the cost of government index. And so each 2 years, we recreate a regression to determine a intercept, which is $628. And then, or excuse me, that's the slope of the line, and the intercept appears on the top of page 13, $9,900,000. So everyone starts off with $9,900,000, and you multiply your population against the amount on the bottom of page 12, excuse me, of 628. Well, my colleague, Mr. Temte, and I prepared that regression again with the newest data. And if you want, you would revise these two numbers to 774 on the bottom of page 4, or bottom of page 12, excuse me, and 11,900,000 on the top of page 13. So again, on the bottom of page 12, you would strike 628 and insert 774. And on the top of page 13, you would strike 9,900,000 and insert 11,900,000. What I would suggest is holding off on that amendment. 2 years ago, it changed a little bit as well, and it makes almost no difference. And when we get to the chart here, you will see, for example, Albany County, which gets impacted almost the most from this change, changed $2,129. So your predecessors 2 years ago said, we don't want to mess with it. We just keep the same formula. In addition, if you do change the formula, it's very modest amounts, but it tends to assist the high population counties and hurt the low population counties. So that's the policy choice you'll be making here. With that, Mr. Chairman, at the last part on page 14, there are 2 additional subsections. Subsection D begins on line 5, and this is a definition. And for purposes of this formula, we are using the 2020 decennial census. So all of your figures here have been updated with the most recent decennial census. It's remarkable how not a whole lot really changed. And then finally, a policy choice in subsection E, which is on page 14, line 10. This is a policy comment that was added almost a decade ago or more. And it states the intent of the legislature that these funds are distributed shall not be used for salary, additional personnel, or increased personnel benefits. The notion at the time when this was inserted is that these funds should be one-time considered, not a standard budget, and that expanding the operations of these local governments should be cautioned. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm almost done finishing up on the discussion here. You can see each of your county and municipality is shown in the 5th column of numbers. If you adopt this bill draft before you without change, that is the amount that we estimate will be distributed to each municipality and county. The 5th column of numbers, and it reads fiscal year 2023 county and municipal total. However, we know that there's a lot of interest in other policies here, so we put a fair number of other comparisons. So right after the bold line, for example, we illustrate what each municipality and county received this year, this fiscal year. So you can see that, I'll take the top line, Albany County in this fiscal year received $1.768 million. Under this new formula, primarily due to the change to the new decennial census, they would be receiving $1,517,000, or a reduction in Albany County of $251,000. So that difference amount compares what it is under this new formula in the bill compared to what the current biennial payment was for each municipality and each county. The next column over, and I titled that one Updated Regression. Keep in mind that only changes the county amount. It has no change on the municipalities. And if you choose to make those revisions on page 11 and 12 for the slope and intercept, you can see it has about a $2,000 change for Albany County. They would do better. And Bighorn County, of course, a smaller populated county, would lose $3,136. If you choose to update the regression model, then you would be using that updated regression model column. Finally, the last two columns, we've been asked to illustrate how much these counties and municipalities received under the ARP distribution. And this is both payments, both the 2021 payment as well as the 2022 payment combined for each municipality. I do know that there were 4 municipalities that elected to decline their payment. So those 4 municipalities are not zeroed out here, but they actually elected not to accept the federal funds. You can see some interesting differences. For example, the counties by and large did much better under the ARP money than the municipalities did. And you can see the difference there is positive in I believe every county actually. Whereas under the municipalities, particularly in Carbon County, for example, with the smaller communities like Dixon, they did not receive very many ARP funds, only 14,000. They perform much better under the state distribution formula because it is so weighted towards the smaller communities and the hardship. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the indulgence and will stand for questions.
I'm sorry, Don, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Could you, Don, I had an interruption. Could you tell me in the very last column difference, it's the difference between what and what?
Mr. Chairman, it's the difference between how much they receive in the ARP funding, the federal ARP funding that is going directly to municipalities and counties compared to the bill before you. So you can see some, counties received a lot more ARP money than they would state funds under this distribution.
So, Mr. Chairman, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th column. It would be the last column minus the 5th column, FY23 county municipal total.
Correct. The second to last column minus the 5th column gives you the last column.
Okay, gotcha. ARP minus. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. Go Stiff first. That's what I heard.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Don, so comparing the column for FY 2022 versus FY 2023, are the differences there just because you're using different census numbers or assessed valuation numbers, or did anything about the formula itself change?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff, nothing about the formula changed, and you're right, there are 3 ingredients. The decennial census, which obviously only changes every decade. That's unusual this year. But then the model was intended to be dynamic. So we're always using the most recent sales and use tax data, as well as the most recent assessed valuation data. So for example, take Albany County. They had a particularly strong sales and use tax year last year because of the wind development that occurred in that county. As a result, proportionally, they are less of a hardship county than they were a year ago, and they would be receiving somewhat less money.
Go ahead.
So the positive and negative numbers there, that if we'd have used the state formula for distribution, I'm still trying to, what is that column actually telling?
Sure, and it was suggested by a couple of requesters, not all on JAC, by the way, but throughout the summer. Some legislators said, given the amount of federal funds that these entities are receiving through the ARP funds, perhaps they do not need the full $105 million. That may be true in some cases. First of all, there were very few exist anymore, but there were restrictions on those funds. Those restrictions have largely been removed because of the new federal guidance. But it was also to point out that not everyone was treated the same. So if you go to Bighorn County, for example, just because it's on the first page, they really did not, the county received a fair bit of federal funds under ARP, but each of those very low populated municipalities typically did not receive a whole lot of material ARP money.
Compared to what though? So what's the difference there again?
So compared to the state distribution.
Okay.
It's because ARP will pay solely.
Was designed to reward.
It didn't have the hardship.
Okay. That's why you're eating your candy bars too. All right, more questions about this? So, any public comment on the bill? Any public comment on the bill? Okay, public comment is closed.
Yeah, I could use Elijah. Are you ready, Mr. Chairman?
Please go ahead.
Yes, for the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I have with me to my far left, Mayor Krakow of Albin, whom you probably all know, who is also the chairman of WYAM's Legislative Committee. And to my immediate left, Mayor Collins of Cheyenne. And so I appreciate having those guys here. I will start by saying that I have appeared before the legislature on this issue more recently than 2005. And I would add that in Mr. Richards' defense, Chairman did ask him to go through the bill. So with that, I'm sure that you all could, you've heard my testimony before. I'm sure you all could give it for me, but I, of course, want to just emphasize how important direct distribution is to our members. We, direct distribution, of course, came about when some revenue was taken from the local governments, and it was it was good. And thank you to the state, to the legislature then sitting, who provided that. It continues to be important to our members, to all of our members, big and small, and we have big and small represented here at the table as well. In some cases, it's real money to all of our members. In some cases, as much as 30% of their general fund budget. So, again, I don't know that I don't believe I'm here making any arguments other than thank you. And using the assumptive close, I guess I'll say thank you in advance for moving this forward to the legislature. And I would certainly entertain any questions that you have for me. I don't know if the mayors wanted to wait for questions or if they had anything they wanted to add.
Mr. Chairman, I'm
Welcome,
Patrick
Patrick.
Collins, Mayor of
How are you?
Cheyenne, and I appreciate the opportunity to come talk on this subject. I would echo Mr. Frazier to say thank you, but I spent the last 40 years as a small business person, and one of the things that always frustrated me was how little of my budget was discretionary. Between my cost of my inventory, cost of my employees, benefits, the insurance, all of those kinds of things. When I sat down with my accountant to look through it, there was just very little that I had a lot of control over. And I was a little bit surprised when I became mayor to realize that that's the same thing here. So right now, today, 75% of my budget goes to employees and their benefits. We have less employees today than we'd had a couple of years ago because of COVID, and I get harassed a lot for the RIFT positions to be brought back. We just can't quite afford them yet, but we're working on that. But what surprised me was the rest of it. 21% of my budget is what my treasurer calls mandatory spending. And I wrote down quite a few of what those things are. Bond payments for capital improvements that we're working on, gas and electricity, telephone communications, property and liability insurance, our support agencies, animal control, public health, emergency management, the amazing cost of IT and the services for our computers, amazing. Audit that we have to do, our HVAC maintenance, elevators, janitorial, copiers, all of those things. No matter what we do, we have to pay them. They're there. So it leaves us about 4% of our budget that we can use for things like training, travel, those types of things. And I keep telling my chiefs that what I don't want is a CNN moment where I'm standing in front of a camera with a CNN microphone explaining how we screwed up. So training is important to me. On any other new capital things that we might want to take on, we have to do with that 4%. And right now, the distribution that we get from the state is 7.2% of my budget. And I'm working really hard to try to make that number smaller because I understand that that's the goal you have for us. And I'm working really hard. But a lot of the communities I talk to, it's between 10 and 25, 30% of their budgets. And so while I appreciate that it's a challenge as you guys are working through your budget, it's really a critical thing for ours. And so I just want to say thank you for your consideration and all that you do for us.
Questions for Patrick? I appreciate it. Good to see you again. Yeah. Okay, please.
Mr. Chairman, Kelly Craco, Mayor Albin, I'll just add a little bit on to that. Like I said, we appreciate anything you do to keep police a minimum of the 105. Because one of the things we're really looking at doing projects now is we've been 6 years at the 105 and we were higher than that before. But you figure the report come out just the last couple of days, inflation's up over 7%. Well, you take an average of 2 to 3% over 6 years, you're up to 15, 20%. So what we can do with the 105 million that we did 6 years ago is about 20% less today. So that really puts us in a bind on that. So anything you can do to at least keep the 105 going, we appreciate it. And I'll stand for any questions that you or the committee may have.
Okay, I don't see any questions. I think you're scaring us. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Any other public comment?
Mr. Chairman, we do have 2 online public comment. We
Okay.
have Jeremiah Riemann and Aaron Anderson. I'll go ahead and let them both into the room now.
Okay, Jeremiah, I like that nice shiny light on your forehead.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I'm in Washington, D.C. with my counterparts and appreciate you allowing me to testify remotely here. I never like to get in front of my commissioners, so I'd love for Commissioner Anderson to perhaps provide a couple of comments, and then I can kind of close out with a couple of things, if that's okay.
All right.
Mr. Anderson, if you'll just go ahead and turn on your mic and camera.
Okay. Can everyone see me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm Aaron Anderson, Washakie County Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, members of Joint Appropriations. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak on the importance of the $105 million in direct distribution for funding to cities, towns, and counties. I think what the gentleman, the mayors, and the gentleman from Wham have said is going to be quite a few things that I reiterate here. Washakie County is a hardship county, and we are really very dependent on direct distribution to maintain essential services. Over the last 6 years, our costs have continued to rise, like the cost of the state and the cities and everyone else. And our revenue, including direct distribution, has remained relatively flat. Our budget process used to be a long, drawn-out process where various groups came before the commission seeking funding for different community services. It's far simpler now. We've trimmed everything back to county services, and no one even asks anymore. Depending on the year, direct distribution accounts for anywhere from 10 to 15% of our budget. Minus that funding, we will struggle to maintain essential services. At least 65% of our budget goes to employee-related expenses, and our health insurance plans continue to get more expensive to fund each year, and the benefits go down. We've resisted raising salaries, kind of in the spirit of the whole thing with direct distribution. We've even frozen the salaries of our elected officials, which was really popular. We've reached a point where in many of our departments, we do struggle to hire people because our salary and benefits are not that competitive. The sheriff's department is a big issue. We train people, we send them to the law enforcement academy, we get them ready to go, and they leave and go somewhere else. The state has faced significant financial challenges, and we're very appreciative of what we've received from direct distribution. The hardship formula, we've tried to use that money responsibly. We're working hard to maintain our services and control our costs in an ever more challenging environment. Inflation's reached new highs, and I'm thankful that we live in a state where our politicians are not afraid to budget responsibly. Debbie Hammonds is a former House District 28 representative, and she said one time, when you're in ranching, which is my profession, you're in the business of selective neglect. I think that in this environment, we're all in the business of selective neglect. For a county like Washakie, this program's a worthwhile priority, and we don't think we can afford to have it neglected. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate all you've done for us. I also would stand for any questions.
Okay, appreciate it. Any questions? All right, who's next?
Mr. Chairman, I'll keep my comments brief. Again, Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. Like my colleagues, I want to thank you for your commitment and support of the direct distribution program over the course of the last decade plus. And that goes beyond just the direct distribution program. That includes the consensus program that was funded at one point in time. It really has made a difference across our communities. We appreciate your continued support of that into this upcoming biennium. It does make a difference in all of our counties, all of our communities. And we're happy to share with you the ways that that happens, and we'll provide examples as you need. I appreciate that there may be some interest in looking at the ARPA funding. And I'd ask you that you resist doing that at any great length. We have asked as an association our members to be patient in considering how to use those funds and to look at the opportunities to amplify the investment that can be made in communities, working with the state, working with the federal government with infrastructure dollars, broadband investment, sewer, water, et cetera. We're also concerned that there have been expenses and will be future expenses relative to the pandemic, that these funds will be necessary in order to respond to. So I think most counties, perhaps all of them, have taken that advice to heart and are looking to partner with you to do great things for the people of Wyoming, consistent with the governor's thought of survive, thrive, and drive. With that, Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for your support. We do support the existing formula, always have, and that wasn't always an easy compromise, but we've gotten there and look forward to working with you. And again, thank you for your support.
All right, Jeremiah, appreciate it. So I thought perhaps you're back in Washington DC so you can be there for the January 6th celebration.
Mr. Chairman, that's not my bailiwick.
All right, any other public comment? Okay, we'll close public comment. Bill has been moved by Representative Larson, seconded by Representative Walters. Discussion on the bill. Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, I had a question to ask the group about page 14, lines 10 through 13. That states that it is the intent of the legislature that the funds distributed under this section shall not be used for salary adjustments, additional personnel, or increased personnel benefits. It seems like in 2005, when you do this for the first time, that language would make some sense, but this money now has been built into their local budgets for 16 years. It's I think for Rock Springs, it's 5% of the budget. For Cheyenne, it's 7%. For some of the smaller communities, it's 10 or 15%.
So I think we put that in 2 years ago.
Was it, but do we get anything out of this? I mean, it doesn't seem like it means anything.
Well, what I'm saying is that it didn't happen in 2005. We put it in 2 years ago.
Right.
Because we were cautious, because we we're running out of money and we didn't want pay raises going out when we couldn't afford pay raises. That's my rough recollection, but any comments on that, or do we have a motion?
Does it?
Right. It's been moved second. Do you have an amendment? You want to take it out? Make a motion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move to amend the bill by deleting lines 10 through 13 on page 14, just because I don't think they
We have a second.
do anything.
We move in second discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I don't know that it's here or there. I mean, that's the intent of the legislature. No real restriction. Whether it's in or out. I think what it does do is I think it makes some people feel better, and it garners more support on the floor. But other than that, I don't think it's either here nor there as a policy matter, whether it's in or out.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I'd just like to see it stay in because it's a statement of what I had always understood this money was to be used for, that it was specifically not to be incorporated into your permanent operating budget. That's what the late Senator Schiffer told me, and our city clerk treasurer and some of the larger cities with professional management have made sure that they, Casper's being one of them, they've never put that money into their operating budget. It goes to one-time capital expenditures. So it was put in there, I think, just to reflect what at least many legislators thought was the intent of it. And certainly that's what I thought at the time. There are some communities that are so impoverished they have no choice but to use it. But it's just a signal that, someday this money may run out. It's not necessarily a guarantee.
Well, there's 2 points that I would comment on. The first one, and the most important one, is what your last statement is. If some counties or cities have to use it because it's that big in their budget, and we're telling them to violate statute by putting this in there. And that doesn't make sense to me. If that is the case, then we ought to have an exception for them, so we're not forcing them to break the law. Why would we do that? And the second component is, if they take this money and they put it in their general budget and they mix it all in one basket, and then they allocate from their general fund out of that basket, then how do we know what dollar is in and what dollar is out? We don't. And so really all it is a legislative statement for us directing counties and cities how to spend their money. And I'm not sure that it behooves us as a legislative body to do so when we know that that they have to then manipulate the dollars in order to demonstrate that it's indirect instead of direct money coming out of their budgets to pay their bills. And that doesn't make us look good as far as I'm concerned. I think we ought to understand what we're doing but more importantly, not ask them to break the law when they have, in order to comply with it. So I'm in favor of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And I would echo the chairman's comments 100% and add, and I'm trying to remember, because I was a commissioner back when this started, and we're trying to recall exactly how it works, but originally there was money that was required to go into capital construction, as Co-Chairman Kinski or Vice Chairman Kinski mentioned. And it became an ongoing problem because you can't always put money into capital construction if you don't have the money to maintain your existing facilities. And Don might remember how that was resolved eventually. I don't, but it was a problem for the counties when they were receiving money that was mandated to go to capital construction. But yeah, to echo again what the chairman said, the money goes into your general fund and you can, you can always manipulate how it looks, but that's just a manipulation. And I don't think we should force the local governments to go through that.
Chairman,
Go ahead.
I can tell I'm not going to win the argument, but I do want, your first point is a little bit of a straw man because there's no penalty attached to it. It's merely a statement of intent. It's not that they're going to be breaking the law. And all I can tell you is there are communities that are very careful to make sure that their ongoing operating expenses do not become dependent upon that distribution, so that if the distribution goes down, they're not having a position to have lay people off. I
Mr. Chairman.
understand some communities manage themselves differently, and so I guess that's their prerogative.
Representative Larson.
Senator Kinski's comments are important to me, and I want to make sure that I understand it right, because as I read that, it says the intent of the legislature that the funds distributed under this section shall not. So if they do, are they in violation of statute or not?
Chairman, it's just a statement of intent. There's no penalty. There's no take back. It says pretty clearly it's a statement of intent.
Mr.
You
Chairman.
can leave it in or leave it out.
And that's my question.
Well, it's a violation of statutory.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Stating an intent. I don't believe there is a penalty for violating.
Yeah.
There's no penalty. It's still violent.
Is it a general intent crime or is it a specific intent crime? We just get the Attorney General back.
Where's the age?
The only point I would make is that if you look at the statement carefully, it's not operating expenses. It's only personnel related expenses. It's not saying you can't use it for any kind of O&E. The only thing it was saying was, in particular at the time, that it's important to recognize the context in which it was given. It was 2 years ago. When we left here, as the session grew to an end, we knew that the budget we had just passed, that before the ink was dry, that it was no good. We knew that we'd be back making significant cuts by the time we came back in the session. The governor knew that he had a big job to do to start that process, because we knew that it was not good. And so going back to the chairman's, I mean, my co-chairman's, this was a restriction on salary adjustments, personnel adjustments. And you were looking at that, the concern was, if you're going to try and lay people off, you don't want to, and you're going to be making those significant budget cuts. You wanted to just try and spare people that where you give it to them and they turn around and have to take it right back. But it's a very narrow, it didn't go to all operating expenses. And quite frankly, that's not the case right now. And so we're seriously considering giving raises, a compensation plan across the state government. We all know how hard it is to keep people. That cities, towns, and counties aren't immune from that. The state's not immune from that. Private business isn't immune from that. So, you look at that, and it's a different time. And so, whether or not the drug distribution is used for operating expenses or not, whether it's not violating statute, I think that fair enough, but at the end of the day, it's not the same as it was 2 years ago when this got put in. It may be that way a year from now, maybe that way 2 years from now, but it's not that,
I
it's not that
think
point now.
this was my motion 2 years ago.
I wasn't going to say anything, Mr. Co-Chair.
This is back when you were for it, before you were against it.
Mr. Chairman, I believe I have a solution that both sides would be happy with. I would propose that we don't eliminate it completely, but we do something with the following. Is the intent of the legislature that the funds distributed under this section shall be considered one time and not be used for ongoing expenses? That gives us intent without damaging. They can run with it and however they want to.
Mr. Chairman, I think you just broadened the. Ongoing expenses could be just about everything.
Mr. Chairman.
Other than one-time capital construction projects.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Well, by way of a little bit more background, and I believe you would recall, you were in the legislature when local governments and some other agencies used to get these automatic distributions above the cap. And then that was eliminated. I can't remember. That was something that I just constantly heard people irritated about it. And that the distribution was intended to help put some of that money back, but without a guarantee. Remember that? When they used to get above the cap money?
Yeah, that was de-earmarking.
De-earmarking,
That was
yeah.
de-earmarking. And this was substantially after de-earmarking started. What was going on was just the state had $1 billion a year surpluses. And I was a county, in fact, Andy and I used to hang out at county commissioner meetings together back then. So it was just an effort to share the benefits that the state was accruing back with the local governments.
Okay.
And so it was, whether or not it's one-time money after 15 years, I don't know anymore if it is one-time money or not. So.
Sensing a lull in the discussion.
So do we have a
Question on the motion.
Do we have a second on Evans? Was
So,
that,
point of order, Mr. Chairman, we have a pending motion.
That's what I mean.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we're
Call the
voting
question.
on the motion.
Right. Thanks.
Which motion?
On Mr. Representative Stiss. No, he didn't. There was no really second to the amendment. So we're going back to the Representative Stiss motion. All those in favor say aye.
aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Can I see a show of hands? All those in favor of Representative Stiff's motion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fails. Okay. I can't get rid of my own minute.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just to share an observation, you can, but it's not very advisable.
Speaks with forked tongue.
Question on the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, question on the bill.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to propose an amendment on page 1, line 11 and 12 to change from LSRA to general fund.
Second.
Move to second discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This year, we have an adequate amount of money within our general fund, and it would make sense to spend our general fund dollars and leave our savings in savings. And so that's why I propose changing the source of the funding, just simply to save allow our savings to last a little longer and use our general fund, because that's an immediate fund versus savings. So again,
All
proposal.
those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, a question on the language on 1A. So we've changed that from do we really have to create an account
No.
in there now that's general fund? So included in his motion, if we can best back that up, can we just clean that up so there's not an account created and it's just it's allocated from the general fund or use the appropriate language. Is that
That's a
is
friendly,
everybody's understanding? Is that all right? We don't need a separate motion for
I
that.
think
do
that's a
we?
Scribner's correction.
What's that?
Yep, yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you, Don.
Those scriveners are prone to error.
Question.
It's already been passed. So any further amendments?
Question on the bill.
Question on the bill? Roll call.
Motion is on 22 LSO 0322, working draft 0.3. Representative Kinner.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Schwartz. Representative Simpson.
Aye.
Representative Stiff.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Senator Guru. Aye. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinsky.
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz. Co-Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the bill is adopted. House bill or Senate file?
What's the house?
House bill. Okay. Okay, who wants the pleasure of presenting this bill? Evan, would you like to do it? Okay, cheers. Next, Don?
Mr. Chairman, the next bill for your consideration is 22 LSO 132, version 0.4. This is the Wyoming Council for Women's Issues. This bill draft would move the Wyoming Council for Women's Issues from the Wyoming Business Council to the Department of Workforce Services. And I believe Councilor Reveille can walk you through the bill.
Welcome.
Good afternoon.
This is fun, huh?
Oh, yeah, indeed. Especially right here. You have a great view.
Yeah, I know.
Shall I begin, Mr. Chairman?
Please proceed.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, this is, as Don said, 22 LSO-0132, working draft 0.4. And what this actually does, it's almost identical to a bill, funnily enough, from 2002, which did this move in reverse. So this is just
Really?
undoing that very move. And so it goes into what it does, it places the Council for Women's Issues, which already exists and is currently in the statutes for the Wyoming Business Council. Instead, it moves it into the Department of Workforce Services. And it transfers the authority and the positions and the property and all of, and the funding for that council. So where this takes place is currently the two statutes that make up this council are at 9-12-501 and 9-12-502. What this bill does is it renumbers them as 9-2-603 and 9-2-604. And the reason it's 603 and 604 is 601 and 602, you'll note say repealed if you go into the statute books. And that's because those were the ones that back in 2002 had been moved over to the Business Council. And now we're moving them back, but we're just iterating it up rather than just replacing the 601 and 602. So on page 2 is where this begins. And you'll note on line 1 where it's just changing the number. And then to affect it on line 5, changes Business Council to Department of Workforce Services. Then on page 3, the same thing. You'll note at line 1, the statute number change. And then rather than on lines 12 through 14, rather than it being the CEO of the Wyoming Business Council, it is the director of the Department of Workforce Services or the director's designee. Then on page 4, it's the council shall elect a chairperson or vice chairperson, and then instead of Wyoming Business Council, it's the Department of Workforce Services. And C is just listed there because these whole things have been moved over to the new section, or to the 2 new sections. Then section 2 of this bill indicates that the members of the Wyoming Council for Women's Issues who are currently serving, they shall continue to serve. And it's just that the ex officio member, instead of being the CEO of the Department of Workforce, or sorry, of the Business Council, shall be the director of the Department of Workforce Services. Section 3 has three subsections. The first one is that any funds that are appropriated to the Wyoming Business Council, including during this upcoming session, shall be transferred to the Department of Workforce Services. Subsection B indicates that all positions, property, equipment, and authority shall be transferred. And subsection C indicates that any obligations shall be transferred and over to Workforce Services. And then the effective date of July 1.
Okay, questions on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, Counselor, is on the section 4, the effective date. Is there a need to have a dual effective date, one that would be effective immediately so that they could begin the planning and the transitional period, and then the final effective date of July 1 as the drop dead date when it actually occurs? We've done this with other transitional legislation. I'm just curious if there's a need in this instance.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, I would love to hear from the Department of Workforce Services who is here about whether they need a transition, because the council itself is staying the same. They don't have, the only new person is the ex officio member who now won't be the CEO of the Business Council, and instead will be Workforce Services. The other composition of the council remains the same. So maybe not is the answer, but I don't want to say it for them.
Go ahead.
The other example, the other thing was, why not, is there any reason that you wouldn't make it effective? This may be for Robin if she comes up to talk about this, but there's no reason why you just wouldn't make it effective immediately upon all acts necessary for it to become law. So that just happens. Is there a reason not to do that?
And Mr. Chairman,
There you go.
as you wish.
Yeah, Robin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Robin Cooley. I'm the Director of Workforce Services. And I don't think we need a transition time because we've already done this pursuant to an MOU, basically. The money has been transferred over. All of the work, we've actually been working with them already. So I think the work's been done. So to put it with an immediately effective date.
That just answers your question. So we have a motion to amend.
Move the bill.
Okay, move the bill.
Okay. You want to take public comment, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman,
Any public comment?
Move the bill.
No, close public, close public comment.
If
Okay.
I may, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
members of the committee, and I did want to let you know, we did speak with the council itself. They're in agreement with this. I would note that not this year, but perhaps next year, they would like to discuss some changes to their responsibility, but I think that they're ready to go with this and moving forward.
Okay, great. Any other public comment? Thanks for your help getting this done, Robin. Okay,
Move the bill. Second.
moved by Representative Larson, seconded by the chairman. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, that motion carries. We have
Roll call.
no, that's what I say, is are there amendments? Where I was going.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 5 of the bill, I would like to propose an amendment in section 4, which is line 23, to delete what is there for an effective date and replace it with the effective immediately language.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, that motion carries. Any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Please, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, on page 4, I would like to reinsert the deleted language on line 1 and 2 and keep it consistent with chairman. We know that that's a neutral term and it's used throughout statute.
The motion, everyone stand on the motion? Is to have it go back to chairman versus chairperson. Discussion? Question being called. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
No. The motion carries. Question on the bill. Okay, roll call. As amended.
Mr. Chairman, just for clarification, I believe Senator Steinmetz, that was on lines 1 and 2, both. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the motion is on 22 LSO 0132, working draft 0.4 as amended. Representative Kinner.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Schwartz.
Aye.
Representative Simpson.
Aye.
Representative Stiff.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Senator Garou. Aye. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinski.
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz. Co-Chairman Nicholas, or Co-Chairman Perkins. Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the bill has been adopted. House
You got a
bill
coin?
or Senate file?
Sure, we'll take it. Senate file. Okay, Don, next.
Mr. Chairman, the next bill for your consideration is 22 LSO 0323, working draft 0.2. This is the workers' compensation COVID-19 legislation. I do believe this has an amendment associated with it.
Yeah.
And
Everyone
Councilor,
got the amendment in their box? Okay, go ahead, Don.
and Councilor Reveille will proceed.
Oh, no. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unless Counselor Jarvis is still around, I'll go ahead and proceed. Just kidding. So this bill relates to the workers' compensation program. And of course, workers' compensation is the system that injures employees that are injured on the job and compensates them for medical bills, lost wages, permanent impairments, etc. Generally, communicable diseases are not covered unless there's a specific risk associated with contacting that disease because of the nature of the job. As background, in the 2020 special session and then again in the 2021 general session, the legislature passed legislation that applied to COVID-19 and indicated that there would be a presumption that COVID-19 that is contacted by an employee is presumed to have occurred because of the increased risk of contacting that disease by the nature of the employment. And that was originally set to expire in December of 2022 or 2020. The legislature then extended it through to March 31st of 2022. And now this legislation would extend that further 1 year to 2023. I believe this was brought up during your budget hearings of the impacted agency, the Department of Workforce Services. So that's a general summary of the bill. We can turn now to it. See page 1, it's an act relating to workers' compensation, amending the time period for which the workers' compensation program is presumed to cover COVID-19 infections. Then page 2, you see the bill going into the definition of injury and clarifying that from the period that began on January 1st of 2020 through March 31st of 2023, an employee that is employed by an employer that is covered under workers' compensation and who is infected with COVID-19, it's presumed that the risk of contracting that illness or disease was increased by the nature of employment. Then finally, there's an effective immediate date in order to ensure that the law will be in effect at the end of session. There is an amendment. It was brought to my attention that during the 2020 special session, there was a provision that allowed for employers to not see their experience rating. Those employers that get COVID-19 claims would not see their experience rating and their premiums change due to the amount of claims or number of claims that are related to COVID-19. The funding would be backfilled by the CARES Act. This amendment, which is, I don't believe it's posted online, it's available there in the room. So I'll explain it carefully for those that are listening. It would go into page 1, line 3, and make changes to the title to include amending the experience rating system and requiring the transfer of specified funds to the workers' compensation fund. On page 1, line 8, it would delete is and insert and 27-14-201 subsection U are amended to read. And then on page
2 after line 21, subsection U of that section 2714-201 would be brought in. And it would clarify that no injury related to COVID-19 for which coverage is provided under this act and for which a claim was filed on or before previously was December 30th of 2020. It would now be March 31st of 2023. Shall be chargeable to an employer's experience rating under this section. The final change would come in and bring in the American Rescue Plan Act funds as funds for which could be used, or if they're available, would be required to be used to backfill the money that's expended. The amount that it costs to not charge employers for their experience rating changes. And I believe the Department of Workforce Services, I've had some correspondence with them and with Mr. Wolf on whether this can be accomplished, and due to the delayed effect of it, an employer's experience rating and how it has worked, I believe that it can be accomplished by just changing the date, that there would not be a gap in which employers would be charged, but they can provide more public comment specifics about that as well. So please let me know if you have any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So first question I have is when we, particularly in the amendment where we go and we change the experience ratings, this is on the amendment, so this is on page 2 after line 21 in the section U. So when we change that the coverage was provided, so we've changed that, and we're making that now chargeable to the employer's experience rated under the section. Ultimately, don't we end up with a split, because we can't go back and charge prior to the effective date of the act? We can't go back and charge retroactively the experience rating to the employer. Isn't that correct? Well, aren't they entitled to the benefit they had of the law at the time until it's changed?
So I don't know that it does that.
But
Hold on, Jason.
but let me just clarify, because I mean, you read it, it says which coverage is provided under the act for which claim was filed on or before, and now that's extended almost 3 years, almost 2 years. And so you've got, so now it's going to read, you see what I'm saying? So you've got an experience rating that up until this passes, that the employers have benefited from it not being a chargeable injury. After this, it says it will be a chargeable injury, but there's no delineation between the charges, the dates that it's charged.
In a new claim versus an ongoing claim.
Yes, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
or Mr. Wolf probably can answer this as well, but this extends the time period for which claims shall not be chargeable. So previously, if the law were allowed to continue in effect as it's currently written, all of those claims that have been filed since December 31st of 2020 would impact an employer's experience rating.
Okay.
This is almost retroactive, and it's saying actually those will not be chargeable to an employer's experience
It's
rating.
not chargeable. All right, thank you.
Go ahead.
Getting late.
So we caught this a few days ago, and I think we'll all remember back in the special session when we talked about allowing a COVID claim to be workers' compensable. That's outside the control of the employer, and we was worried that it would impact their experience modification rating. Whereas traditional accidents, they have some control over in workplace safety and those sort of things. But we're allowing, and so we said it wouldn't impact their experience modification rating if it was a COVID-related incident. Then we extended it last year, the ability to be a workers' compensational event, but we missed getting this exemption on the EMR. We caught it this time. We want to get it put back in to make sure that we're not impacting businesses' EMR rating if it's a COVID-related incident. Right?
Sound right, Jason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes. And I think maybe I'm misreading it, but I think to Chairman Perkins' point, it does say shall be chargeable. I think
No,
we're missing.
You got to read the first sentence. Read the first sentence. No injury shall be chargeable, basically.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, yes. Okay. Yep.
So I have a couple questions. Number one, how many claims for?
Go back and this, I was looking for that. We
Yeah.
talked about this year before, about the claims that are out there already. Now we're going to extend this another year. So can you, I think you're going to ask that same question. Is this for, bring us back up to date on what we talked about when during the hearing on the claims?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, yeah, so I think as of this last week, as of Monday, we're about 1,900 claims total filed for the COVID presumption. We have 23 fatalities filed. Not all of those have received payment out yet, so it's pending. All told, for all those 1,900-ish claims, we are almost at $9 million total paid out. You'll remember back in December when we were before you, that amount was only about $7.5 million. So it is continuing to grow. It grows depending on the cycle of the healthcare providers billing us. You'll see jumps anywhere from 3 to 6% per week. So I anticipate, like we were talking about in our budget hearing, it is probably very underreported. I think there's, obviously how many COVID claims we have out there, COVID fatalities that are reported out there. I think just a little over 1,500 in Wyoming, and we only have 23 reported. So you can, to our discussion in December was the exposure to the fund. Right now that presumption goes through March 31st of 2022. And in theory, because of the statute of limitations, our exposure actually exists for another year beyond that.
Well, I think I just saw an email. We had 2 deaths over the weekend. I don't know if they're employees or stuff.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So question, I guess, for the witness or for the group, I get the policy change on the handwritten amendment. That makes a lot of sense to me, right? I mean, that's what we're here to fix, because otherwise we make our employers look like they're a lot more dangerous places to work than they are. What I guess I don't understand is why we need to change the date on the original one at all. That is why, it was kind of unusual for us to say that COVID was a work-related illness to begin with. Why are we injury? Why are we extending the definition of work-related injury? It just seems like we exposed to the state to additional not wrongful death, but to additional benefit claims that frankly could become expensive, that really aren't work-related and shouldn't burden the workers' compensation system. So I guess I'm looking for the policy justification for changing 2022 to 2023. I'm not getting
right. Mr. Chairman, if and I like that's this question, which brings us back. I mean, so I don't know. Which is my question is, you had 1,900 claims in the first go round. If we extend this a year, do you have any reason to believe that those claims will go up, down, or be the same? And what would be your best estimate based on the past experience? We're expecting another 1,900 claims.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, it's really a shot in the dark. Again, I think there's an element of extreme underreporting. Given that we've already had the door open for a year, for example, and we've only seen 1,900 claims, I personally wouldn't anticipate a whole lot more, but it's really hard to tell. I mean, again, there's a part of it being like both underreported and kind of under advertised probably on our part. We do our best to get the word out to employers that, hey, you can file a workers' comp claim for that. It won't be chargeable. But, there's still, and then there's an element of folks that just don't want to apply for the benefit.
So Jason, in addition to the death penalty benefits, 9 million, how much have we paid in medical bills for folks that have been hospitalized? Or, are we paying for emergency room folks who guys are on an ECMO machine and a respirator and they're intubated?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, the $9 million figure that I gave encompasses all fatalities and medical. So I believe the fatality portion accounts for almost 2/3 of that amount.
Mean paying death benefits.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And it may be anecdotal, but just along Representative Stiff's line of questioning. The other thing that occurs to me is talking with a number of friends and acquaintances who are medical providers and going through the Delta surge that we've had over the last year was in large part seemed to hit hardest males, working age males. And so, I look at that and I don't know. So just adding to your issues about a shot in the dark, opening it up, and maybe it's the right thing to do, but ultimately, I think my anticipation is that you may have significantly more workers' compensation claims if it's a presumption, if it's a presumption in the workplace.
So I have another couple of questions. Number one, if we don't do this, the way it's currently written, they can file claims through 2022, March of 2022, or 23, because you said there's a year after it.
So, Mr. Chairman, yeah, currently the current law that you guys have put in place extended that presumption through March 31st of 2022. But the statute of limitations in Title 27, 14503 technically allows there to be a filing 1 year from that date, correct?
So then my next question is for Kevin. Kevin, it seems to me that this has an impact on our workers' compensation fund directly related to COVID. So why couldn't we use ARPA direct dollars to pay back the fund for the cost to the fund?
Mr. Chairman, I'll put it on the list.
So,
Mr. Chairman, so here I think committee is another important point in listening to Representative Stiff's comments. So if we say we don't want to extend the benefits out to 2023, we still it would be very beneficial to make sure that we get the amendment passed in part of this bill, because we missed that gap last year that could impact the employer's EMR. So just bear that in mind, not to just.
Right. So Mr. Chairman, and that's my question. So back on the original bill, on line 2, page 15, you look, and that's where it extended from March 31 of 2022 to March. But I read that entire sentence for the period beginning if the bill as it's proposed to be changed, for the period beginning January 1, 2020 through March 31 of 2023, unless otherwise expanded by the legislature, if any employer in an employment sector for which coverage is provided by this act is infected with COVID-19, shall we presume the risk of contracting the illness or disease was increased by the nature of the employment. So there's not a limiting factor. Doesn't that just open it all the way back up? So again, anybody who's contracted COVID beginning January 21st through March 31st, 2023 is eligible to file a claim, and the presumption is that COVID was at the workplace.
So
That's what it does.
All that means the burden of proof shifts to the employer to say,
Or the
no, he
division.
didn't get it counted.
Yeah.
He has to prove otherwise. Go ahead.
Thank you. If you recall, when we passed this originally in the special session, we did it for a simple reason, because we didn't know. We didn't know much about anything about COVID. I am in favor of this bill and in favor of the amendment, but we still don't know. And we still don't know a lot of questions. I mean, some would say that if you're vaccinated, you stand at a better risk. Others may not be. 5 years from now, we might have right now, we don't know. That's why I think it's
Well,
imperative
actually,
that
we do know that if you're vaccinated, you have less likely to be sick. So maybe you could bring an amendment that says that presumption only lies if you're vaccinated.
And I plan, Mr. Chairman, on bringing that very amendment, but not today.
Mr. Chair,
go ahead.
Thank you. Just to echo my county associate, there's a lot we still don't know. And it's workers' compensation. I get that the businesses pay, but I want to make sure the workers are protected. That's the purpose of workers' compensation. And I think you all can make the logical conclusions from that.
We'll debate the bill here in a minute.
Okay. Further discussion on the bill.
Is there any other comments from the division, Mr. Chairman?
I think, Mr. Chairman, I would just make the note, if it helps your discussion, the research that I know of from other states and associations that I belong to is that other states have, not opened the door quite so far. I'm not saying that's good or bad. In fact, some people have only passed presumption related to healthcare and first responders. Ours is for, the presumption is for basically every worker who's covered under the act. So it's just information that may help you make decisions, so.
Okay, further discussion?
Move the bill.
Second.
Any public comment? First. Okay, we'll close public comment.
Now I move.
All right, moved by Vice Chair, seconded by Senator Drew.
So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, this is a significant policy decision. And quite frankly, yeah, I think it would be, even though we don't know the number, quite frankly, I don't know that I would not be comfortable voting in favor of this bill unless there's a $20 to $30 million appropriation. Because this is right, we've got a worker compensation fund that is healthy right now. But it's not fair to simply say that it can absorb this unknown risk. And this is really significant. And so if we're going to do this, I think it's really important we put our money where our mouth is. And we have to do this and not just say that, we've got enough room in.
Mr. Chairman.
Let's just follow up with that. Jason, what is, do you have any idea or estimate on the impact on the fund? It's roughly 2 billion, I think, right?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think, and I apologize for forgetting this. Hopefully you guys did receive the memo that we sent with the letter from the actuary that I had them draft. I'm not sure if that's before you today or not.
What does it say?
It's actually on, it says Oliver Wyman Actuarial Services at the top. So anyway.
And the conclusion is?
Their conclusion is, I asked specifically the question if, that we had during the budget discussion was, what if we had, say, a $200 million liability to the fund? What would that do to rates? Very cautiously, the actuary says that, and you've heard me talk about this before, but our provision for adverse deviation, or PFAD, which is the money that is above and beyond our discounted liabilities, stands today at almost $1.25 billion. So that is basically 74% of the discounted liabilities, which are about $1.3 billion. So he says, or the actuarial team says that $200 hit seemingly could be absorbed by the fund without any real damage to employers or rates for that matter. So again, that's very, I think, cautious wording that they put in their memo to you.
Yeah, but I think that kind of defeat doesn't address the real issue. Is there has to be some impact to the fund. Because someone's got to pay for it, and no one is paying for it. So I agree with the general concept that our co-chair. But what I would suggest is we put in language that says that we direct whatever, you pick a number, 10 or $20 million from COVID direct dollars, if they're eligible, to repay the fund for the expenditures of claims paid under the claims for COVID-19.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Isn't that the purpose of the amendment we have here? It says the division shall estimate the cost to the fund of an injury subject to the subsection and shall deposit into the fund or dedicate within the fund the amount of the estimated cost, but only to the extent federal monies are available for that purpose. I take that to read that all deals are off. I read that to say all deals are off if there's no federal money, or do you read it to say if there's no federal money, we have to come up with the money?
Right, Mr. Chairman.
I mean, and let's ask Tamara that question. I mean, I think that's a good question. That's a legal question. So let's ask our lawyer.
Sure.
Go ahead, Tamara.
Members of the committee, that's right. So this amendment does amend the existing language that had set aside any available CARES Act fund, and that's a mandatory shall be deposited, to also include the American Rescue Act funds or from any other available federal monies related to COVID-19 emergency response. And this language did originate in the special session, and it was probably crafted trying to imagine a lot of different contingencies of what the federal government would do in the next couple of years. And now it is not as specific as it could be. Certainly you could get the fiscal impact of this as calculated by the department and the actuaries and make a specific appropriation from a specific portion of funds. Otherwise, it's just going to be left to the department ultimately and the executive branch to determine if there are available funds that can be expended for the purpose. And if so, to go ahead and make that deposit into the account to make it whole. There's no date related to this subsection U. And so it would be on the department to interpret that, likely the effective date of the act, and determine when to make that deposit.
Mr. Chairman.
Hold on a sec, Mr. Coach.
Thank you. And so two things. One is I'm not sure how the division, I understand how the division has to estimate the cost. I understand that, but how do they deposit without an appropriation from the legislature in some way to deposit that money unless it's a directive to the governor's office to do that with whatever money's available? So that's question one, if that makes sense. And then question two goes back is that regardless of this amendment, the benefits that have been accrued by workers that have had COVID under this are set, and it doesn't matter where we fund it from. We've entitled them to those benefits through the passage of this statute, which made it a work-related injury. Is that not correct?
Mr. Chairman, to your first question, this language itself is a grant of authority and actually a mandate of authority to expend certain funds, but it is not an example of a good appropriation because it's not specific. It doesn't say how much or who is to make that determination. And I don't mean that we were drafting, I imagine the legislature was acting very quickly during the 2020 special session, and this is what was passed. So I do think there is room to be more specific with that language and to have your appropriation be that it is normally used by the legislature, which is specific and does tell agencies when and how to move money. Otherwise, it's a grant of authority and it is appropriated through this legislation itself, but it's not an example of our standard appropriation. To the second question, yes, if there are no funds available that can be deposited as is required under subsection U, then it does not change the fact that employers cannot be charged for those original claims filed before December 30th, 2020. So I assume that there's already been a deposit of funds related to those claims, but I don't have the specifics of that. So I'll leave that to the department to comment on, but that would have gone back to the original CARES Act and the determination by the executive branch that funds were available and would have moved those over. So I'll leave that to them to answer if there's already been some of the transfers have been related to this subsection itself.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I believe, I don't have the exact number before me today, but I do believe that the governor's office, before the expiration of the CARES Act dollars, whenever that date was, we deposited, I want to say it's $3.5, maybe $5 million into the fund from CARES Act.
Was that for the fund? Was that just a CARES Act distribution, or was that directed?
That was using up that CARES Act money.
Yeah. Yeah, that didn't have anything to do with this, I think.
Well, it kind of.
Well,
it was just a partial funding.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. Representative Stiff.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think we have two issues. One is to make sure we do no harm today, okay? And the other is to try to fix something. And so on the do no harm piece of it, I would move to amend the bill draft to delete section 1, That is page 1, lines 8 through 13, page 2, lines 1 through 22. Because that, in my view, is not what we'd asked to be done and just expands this problem. That is, I don't think there's any reason to, because all that really does is extend the eligibility for COVID to be treated as a workers' comp injury by another year. And I don't see any big policy justification for that.
It's been moved and second. You want to discussion on the amendment?
So we move,
Yeah.
okay. So, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, I'm in favor of this, and one is I really, we don't know what we don't know, but the other thing is I actually took the opportunity to listen to oral arguments at the Supreme Court on the OSHA arguments last week, and listened for about an hour and a half. And one of the significant arguments made by the attorney generals talking about this was, and why it was inappropriate to apply for that order to be enforced, was that the attorney generals of the states opposing the mandate came in and said that one of the great things about COVID, or one of the most difficult things about COVID in the workplace, is how is the exposure and the risk that you have from COVID in the workplace any different than you have from COVID in any other public environment, whether it's the grocery store, whether it's your family with kids moving to and from school and coming home, meeting with grandkids, meeting with families, meeting at churches. How is that different overall than the workplace? And so if that's the logic that's used in opposing that order, I don't know how you come back. And this is the exact opposite of that. It creates a presumption that it is at the workplace where the greatest risk occurs. So, I mean, if just for the sake of consistency, and if you're going to have
Whether or not
sauce for goose or sauce for the gander,
whether or not you were at work or not.
there you go. But that's the other, but you know, that's the significant inconsistency between what this state has joined in an argument about COVID and mandatory orders, and then what we're doing here. And I think we need to try to, in my mind, their logic and doesn't have all to do with what we do here, but in this case, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So if you delete that, what's the purpose for the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Other than the correction?
the purpose is to adopt the second amendment, which really does matter, so that employers don't have an experience rating that's artificially unfavorable to them.
So just to make sure that we're clear, if we deleted section 1, Jason, this question to you, if we deleted section 1, we have this gap on the EMR liability for this past year because we didn't get that section you corrected. So if we come in on this amendment, corrected the date to say March of 2022, would that take care of the gap that we have, or do we need to carry that out to 2023?
Mr. Chairman, if you would just extend subsection U, that amendment to March 31st of 2022, that should allow us, the division, to non-charge those expenses for injuries occurring 1/1/21 through 12/31/21.
Okay, and then, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up question maybe to the two chairmen.
Sure. They just say, I'm struggling with what you just said, because the claims have to be for the period of March 20 through March 31 of 2022. That's what the law is now.
But we didn't.
And so, but now, where a claim was filed on or before March 31 of 2023, maybe I guess that's the year that you were talking about. You do have, usually those have to be filed within 15 days, but there's some exceptions, allow that to be longer.
2 or 1 or 4.
I'm just trying to make sure that those dates sync up the way that they need to for this.
Yeah, and I apologize, Mr. Chairman, I don't have the copy you guys probably have, but my copy that was emailed me from Tamara, she inserted subsection U, crossed through December 30, 2020. Thank you, sir.
So you're just saying that's just the filing date, not the work period.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So yeah, no injury related to COVID-19. Yeah. In my reading of it, I would say that just changing that date to March 31st, 2022 will allow the division to then non-charge those expenses.
And that cleans up the error we created last year in Senate File 19.
Mr. Chairman,
Correct.
I read that a little differently, so help walk me through it. I think on the amendment, it says filed, but back in the narrative on the bill, what's existing says when a person gets sick between January 2020, I'm on line 15, page 2. So it gives a time frame which says March 31st, 2022. That's a sick period. The other one is appropriate. I think we can leave the red line on the amendment because it's saying you're going to now have 1 year after you get sick to file.
Maybe.
I think what this is the difference. I mean, the one is this is for on the if the amendment, which is to remove the the first section. And so what you've got is you've got if the period as the bill is, as the law is right now, is that the illness had to arise. The COVID had, which you're claiming the work-related injury has to be between January 1st of 2020 and March 31st of 2022. And so in the language here, we're tying it to a filing, and that concerns me because it's a filing. And so maybe it's what we're just talking, are we just talking about claims that are arising for claims that are under this act that arise prior to that date? Because I mean, they can't arise really and be COVID presumed unless they're within that confined time period. But I think the thing that's caused us the issue is the fact we're saying claims filed, and who knows when claims get filed.
Agreed. I'm tracking with you, Mr. Chairman. So I would probably recommend that instead of using the word filed, I think in other statutory language, something there, dates of injury between XYZ and ABC instead of filed.
So it'd be the covered claim or something like that.
Yeah.
What does Tamara have some up with that?
Tamara, do you understand what we're saying?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I am tracking, and thinking back on it, this may have been an issue with the CARES Act that was going to expire. The use of funds needed to expire on December 2020. So that might have been the absolute cutoff date that was selected for both of the filings and the dates for which the injury or infection would be covered when it occurred. But now that those dates are not as they were, there is more years to work with. I think that you do either want to make the change of allowing an extra year for filing to account for the statute of limitations, or to tie it back to the period of the infection or the date of the injury rather than the date of the filing.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I would think without the presumption that our exposure would be fairly minimal. I mean, I know that workers' comp laws are intended to be construed liberally, but I think somebody would play heck trying to prove that they picked up COVID-19 in the workplace. For the same reason that the chairman mentioned with the attorney general's making the argument to the Supreme Court, how do you know you didn't get it at school from a kid, you didn't get it going to the grocery store, wherever. I would think there'd just be minimal claims under that without the presumption. And I'm in favor of getting rid of the presumption. I'm saying I don't think there's much exposure, whether it's 2022 or 2023.
All right, I've got an amendment. So anyway.
So can I follow up with, so I have a follow-up question that comes back to Chairman Perkins is we heard that we've had claims against the fund. I don't think we've reimbursed the fund for those claims. We've had infusions of CARE money into the fund, but I don't think the intent of that infusion was to reimburse for the claims paid out of the fund. If maybe, but so my question is you brought up an appropriation or something, and we've asked Kevin about this, do we want to then consider additional language in there where she's added the American Rescue Plan to cover those costs?
The answer is whatever that number is, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll fix
Okay.
that in a second.
Okay.
Got
Mr.
it.
Chairman.
Please, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm curious about the amount of CARES Act money that we did put into the fund. And there was some mention, Jason, just a minute ago about $3 or $5 million right at the end, the extra. But weren't there deposits made prior to that? And if so, how much were those?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Kenner, not to the workers' comp fund. I believe we had major deposits to the UI fund, which are two separate
Okay,
accounts.
okay.
Maybe what.
All right,
And
that was
a
my-
rate holiday.
Mr. Correct.
Okay, good. Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
let's step back from that issue and let's finish the work on this language, because what I want to is get enough language so we can get a brand new draft, Tamara, from you without the amendments, and we'll kind of start over on the new draft. Well, with the amendments taken out, what we just took out. And Mr. Co-Chair. go ahead.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Tamara, I think this might help. So trying to round out Representative Stiss, which is this is the adoption of, I think you moved the adoption of section U. in the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my motion was limited to deleting section 1, sort of first things first, clean it,
Okay,
create a blank slate, and then we can write on
And
it.
that passed.
that passed.
I don't think we voted.
I thought it passed. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All those in favor of that amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries.
No.
Motion still carries.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm motion.
Hold on,
Well, go ahead. No, he's got the motion.
Yeah, I just move that I'd like to move amendment dealing with the subsection U.
Second. Right, so Mr. Chairman.
go ahead.
So I think on the amendment, I think what would help us right now,
So this is amendment to the.
this is an amendment to the amendment. And so if you look, I think if on line 13 of the proposed amendment, we just you would insert after which after the word claim is, insert the words for a compensable injury was filed. And so if it's a compensable injury under the act, then what we're doing is we're creating a deadline for any claim so that those claims have to be filed by, and then you could leave whatever date you want to put in there, March 31, 2023, whatever date you want to leave in there. But ultimately, it narrows it down to it's a compensable claim, and it's going to create a statute of limitations basically on claims, whether they're known or unknown or whatever. I
Friendly
think that's going to
amendment.
be the intent. So that would be the first amendment to
So a
the,
claim for a compensable injury.
for which a claim for a compensable injury just was filed. So just insert the words or a compensable injury after the word claim.
Okay.
I like the concept.
Me too.
All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Now we ask you a question.
It really doesn't matter. I'll just read all about it. What was the date? The question, Mr. Chairman, was what was the date you were talking about?
We didn't change the
23.
date.
We didn't change the date.
So 23.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So
That's all.
then, Mr. Chairman, another amendment to this one. Amendment would be on line 15 after the word section with a period.
Okay.
I would delete the rest of the paragraph. So we'll just deal with this appropriation separately.
Okay. All those in favor, we have a second.
Second.
All those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion carries. Okay, now,
Question on the bill.
no, what we want to do now is put in language that so Tamara can work with it on reimbursement to the funds. So now we need to go back to the question of, Kevin, what was put into the fund and under what, was there any written language from the governor's directive for what it was for or anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, I can find the two UI events the first one and the second, and then the conversion back from ARPA to CARES, but I haven't found the workers' comp contribution fund balance.
So I can't remember a direct deposit into the corpus of the workers' compensation fund. There was one?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I'm certain that there was some emails and stuff going back and forth where we did here comes our number cruncher.
Okay, number cruncher. Green light. Introduce yourself.
That helps. Mr. Chairman, Robin Martin, CFO, new CFO.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Rob.
Hold the mic closer. Come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly.
All right, I am trying to get the information as we speak. There was a $14 million premium work comp credit repayment issued into the fund and 19.5 thousand for administration.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So my recollection on the $14 million premium repayment was that we actually redo, I mean, is there actually, wasn't that one for one offset on actual premiums from employers during the COVID height?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you guys passed a bill, I forget which session now, but we gave basically a 1 month rate holiday to all premium paying employers, which equated to about 16.5 million.
Right. So that was a net, that was intended to be pretty close to a net zero on that.
Correct.
Yeah, but that was just a premium repayment. Had nothing to do with the impact of the fund.
Correct.
So Tamara, I think, Mr. Co-Chair, what we would like is to have language drafted that directs a number that I think it's roughly 9 million, but we can get that number from Jason. And we want to tie it down and have the ARPA direct dollars reimburse the workers' compensation fund for the costs associated with COVID claims. And then, then the only question on that drafting is, do we put in language so that it happens again at the end of the year, and then next year? Or do we need to come back in and get real numbers?
Let's come back in and get the numbers.
So let's just do a hard number, and then we can come back and then supplement it. That way we're ahead of any audit that may happen on the dollars that we appropriate. Okay, does that make sense, Tamara?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Let me clarify though, that 9 million will cover the prior claims, and then there'd be an intent to come back in and appropriate for the claims that have occurred that are not yet known how much they will be. And so do you want any language reminding you or hinting that will happen?
That's Jason's job.
Jason and Dawn and Elizabeth
And
Karen.
Kevin. All right, so that's a conceptual amendment. Everyone agreeable with that?
Yep.
All right.
Second.
And so what we would like, Tamara, is just to redraft the whole bill. And so we have a replacement bill. And that'll be easier for us to explain and put forward. And whenever you get to it, just let us know and we'll take it up next week sometime.
Where's the 9
Perfect.
Don?
Mr. Chairman, I think you have voted on 3 amendments to this, but not the underlying language.
We get adopted amendment as amendment.
Okay, as amended and conceptually amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion carries. Motion carries.
Good work. Good work.
Yeah,
So we're down to
on the run.
Not a good quote.
Don, what's next?
Mr. Chairman, next bill for your consideration is 22 LSO 324, working draft 0.4. This is the Employment Support Fund amendments. And I believe Tamara is available to walk you through this 2-page bill.
Go ahead, Tamara.
Mr. Chairman, this bill draft now relates to the unemployment compensation program, and it impacts the Employment Support Fund, as the title hints. This is the fund that primarily supports the state workforce centers, I understand. The title states amending the management of the Employment Support Fund, providing for the biennial transfer of unexpended funds, and providing for an effective date. This bill on page 1 goes into Wyoming statutes 27.3 to 11, the statute subsection A that creates the Employment Support Fund. And on page 2 brings in some language to notwithstand the existing statutes that relate to the reversion of fund, and to clarify that unexpended amounts remaining in the fund at the end of any fiscal biennium shall not be transferred. Now, as background, I think the agency requested some statutory changes, and the committee originally wanted to see 2 options. One option would be also related to the reversion of funds, but would provide that funds in this employment support fund would never sweep to the unemployment insurance trust fund, as you can see they do under existing law on lines 10 through 12. This is the option that the committee decided to hear today, and it's before you. I do want to clarify some of the drafting that went into this. I looked at existing statutes and found that this existing language was probably unique, the only instance in which a fund worked in this manner, where rather than reverting funds at the end of a fiscal year or biennium, the unappropriated amounts would be swept to another fund. I attempted to make it consistent with other statutes that refer to unexpended funds or unexpended amounts. I think, though, that this is a substantive change, looking back through the department's budget requests over the years and the funding history of the fund and whether the funds have ever been swept. It doesn't seem to me that they have ever been swept, because the legislature must be appropriating the entire amount of the fund in each of their bienniums, in each of their budgets. So this may be something the committee wants to consider. What funding should stay in the employment support fund? And should it be swept at the fiscal year end? Should it be swept at the biennium? And should it be those unexpended funds, those unexpended unobligated funds, or those unappropriated funds? And terminology does matter here. So I just want to put it to the committee. I may have misunderstood or didn't have all the information when drafting. I do want to make sure that this draft does accomplish what your intent is. In any event, unexpended amounts may raise issues, and if you want to leave it at that, it should be unexpended, unobligated amounts, to ensure that if the department has existing obligations, that at the close of the biennium, those funds can remain to be paid off of those existing obligations. Finally, the effective date is immediately. I will take questions now.
Questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Tamara, I just want to make sure I have it straight, because I think what we were trying to do with the was to have more of the limited scope with this bill, just to sweep the funds at the right time, because right now it's being swept out, which causes them problems with their funding and how the payouts work just from one year to the next. It was more of a larger question about sweeping the funds forever. And that was a philosophical question that I didn't really want to take up today. But that was kind of what we decided would be the easier course of the two, or more palatable, not a philosophical question, just a timing question. So did I get that wrong somehow? Very possible.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that that's right. That's the change there on line 2. On page 2, line 10. Any amounts remaining in the fund at the end of the fiscal biennium shall be transferred to the state treasurer, to the state unemployment insurance fund. The remainder of the changes were what I assumed were technical on my first draft, and after some discussions from the department, I do want to make sure that those are capturing the committee's intent. In looking back through the budget requests, I don't see that any funds have ever been swept in recent years, which must mean that all funds have been appropriated by the legislature every year. So the distinction here is on line 9, whether we leave in that strike of unappropriated and change it to unexpended, unobligated. And the difference is if you appropriate funds and they're not used, then those funds would, under existing law, remain in the fund, I believe, under the department's interpretation. If you make the change, then those funds would be swept, just like every other reversion is. If they're unexpended and obligated at the end of biennium, they would actually be swept to the trust fund there.
Okay, any more questions for Tamara? Everyone understand what we're doing?
Sure.
Yeah. Do I have to obligate myself in answering that?
I'm not sure what we're doing. I'm kind of lost. I
I'm
was
not
thinking
sure
this was
either.
something, and it's not.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Don?
Mr. Chairman, I think Tamara alluded to this, and we have not discussed this, but I think on line 9, if you are in favor of keeping the language the way it is, any unexpended amounts, I think we should insert the words unobligated after unexpended. Just because you might have an encumbrance or something like that. That's kind of policy decision number 1. Alternatively, you could say any amounts not appropriated. So you have kind of a choice there. Maybe you wanted to restrict their appropriation and that becomes the trigger or the limitation on the available funds to sweep.
Don, I just need a little help. I think my brain's foggy. So tell me in a nutshell what this bill does.
I think the department and perhaps they would be better to present, but I think their concern was that they are subject to a sweep at the end of every fiscal year rather than at the end of the biennium. And so the change on line 10 is the heart of the bill. It changes it from every fiscal year to every fiscal biennium. However, in doing that, there's a question, because you're at the end of the biennium, you have a choice. Should you sweep anything that is not spent? And by spent, I mean unexpended, unobligated, or any amounts that were not appropriated.
And how much funds are likely to be in here? And how does it wind up here? Robin? Or somebody?
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Mr. Chairman, many members of the committee, again, Robin Martin, CFO, there is a lot to unpack with this request. You are correct. The challenge as it was initially presented was the fiscal year sweep. That creates a little bit of a problem when we're working with a biennial appropriation and trying to balance revenues with the expenditures and just doing a cleanup and trying to work toward a better transparency effort. So that was problem number 1. Problem number 2 then becomes the volatility right now of those funds that go in are a direct result of the collections off of the taxes collected through the employment support or that go into this employment support fund. I do want to make a note of correction. These funds, this employment support funds are, they help offset expenses on the UI side as well as the workers, the one-stop operations on the ENT side of the house, the employment and training. So it does do a lot for our agency.
Go ahead, Rob.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Yes, some people would maybe say we should have maybe kept our mouths shut this time, but these funds have become so critically important to the work that we've done the past couple of years. And when we looked at that language with the potential sweep at the end of each year, we just, that would cripple some of our efforts in terms of the UI gaps that we're filling, as well as the services that we're providing in the workforce center. So we just didn't feel this is a necessary change for those funds in our view, so that we can plan and we can be certain that we've got funds for those services where we need them.
Sam Larson.
So Director Cooley, so then we've got those funds sitting there. We've appropriated them to you to use. At the end of that biennium now, we're going to switch and go to the end of the biennium. at the end of that biennium, they may not all have been expended, but you may have some that are obligated that you need to. And so it would appear to me that the language that Dawn suggested, that any unexpended, unobligated funds would be the, help us with how you see that language, because we know that you would still have some obligations even though they hadn't been expended. So help us understand how you think that language should look.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that you're absolutely correct. When we first looked at the draft of this, we saw unappropriated, and that did cause us a lot of concern. But when we saw unexpended, that caused us some concern because we were afraid that that would be potentially capture encumbered funds, but not expended funds. So the unexpended and the encumbered, I think, is the better language. Robin, would you agree?
Go ahead.
So as I understand it, the current balance is roughly 7 million. That's the first question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, as of right now, today, the current balance is 6.7 in the Fund 034. However, we do have appropriation and unobligated amounts at just over 6.1 million. So that really leaves the excess around 500,000, just over. Our concern is really, rather than sweeping those funds, leaving those in that fund so that we can revisit the appropriated amount and make sure that we have a high enough appropriation to meet the needs of our constituents. And some of these new funding programs that are coming through, these funds work to offset the additional costs that sometimes do help support those programs. Just as one example, we do have our WOTC program, which is the Work Opportunity Credit Program. We only get $66,000 per year to run that program, which doesn't fund a full FTE. So these funds in many ways then support the additional cost for that, where we don't have to come to you all for more general funds.
So you're confirming my assumption. So I guess my question is, we could just stop at line 7 and just say it shall not revert and be done? Because I think the variance in the fund is such that we're not going to be worried about it building up a huge balance, and that just simplifies it.
Well, my question is, why do we need to create a fund? Why do we need to create the employment support fund?
It's been around for a long time.
It's already there.
Correct, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. I believe it was created prior to 2009-ish, somewhere in there.
So with regards to Representative Schwartz's statement, does that make it simpler?
Mr. Chairman, that is absolutely our preference, yes. Thank you.
So do we have an amendment? Wait, we haven't moved this bill yet.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion.
We got to move the bill first.
Oh, move the bill.
Wait, let's do public comment. Any public comment on the bill? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Move the bill.
Yeah.
Moved by Representative
I propose
Schwartz,
an
seconded by
amendment.
Senator Guru.
I propose an amendment that
I have a, I have a question about the bill and with your proposed amendment. And so when we say it doesn't revert, and then anything that what was happening is it being swept and was just going into the trust fund. So anything that was left over just automatically went into the trust fund. So, and if we leave it down and it says it shall not revert, and we strike the rest of that language, now it also strikes language that would be swept into the trust fund. So and maybe that doesn't make any difference. So my question, Mr. Chairman, to our good folks from Workforce Services is, what's the most ever been left of this fund at the end of the biennium?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you repeat your question?
What's the most that's ever been left in this fund at the end of a biennium?
Historically, I would guess well, I don't want to make a guess. I
Estimates.
would estimate about 5 million at the most. I don't know that this fund has gotten the attention in the past that it needed to, but I will say that right now what we're watching is the grant funding, the grant awards that run 3 years that overlap. These funds again run with those programs so that when those are exhausted, they directly hit these funding to make sure that we're
And
continuing
Mr.
those
Chairman,
programs.
how much is appropriated into this fund on a biennial basis? What's the standard budget request for this fund?
Mr. Chairman, so again, coming in as a newer fiscal person representing the budget, what I can see is in 21, both, so this falls into 2 different units, 0150 and 0301. Both of those biennial budgets were reduced from the base to the standard budget. In 0150, it was reduced by about 400,000. In 0301, it was reduced by about $2.5 million. Again, that was in BFY 21. So BFY 23, they're pretty standard with what we had in 21. The 0150, which again is the employment and training workforce centers, is just under $2 million. The UI side of the house is 0301, and that appropriation in this biennium is 5.4 million.
So anyway, it's just 7.5 million essentially, just about.
Correct.
Don, did you have some numbers for us?
Mr. Chairman, yes, on page 49 of of the department's budget request, it shows a carryover of slightly over $12 million at the end of the 2018 biennium, 17-18 biennium. It appears, just from the information provided here, that the department has never swept money to the state trust fund, according to their own information.
So another reason why we need to do this.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, we actually have swept, my records here go back to BFY 13, 15, and 17. BFY 19 is still open. We are currently still spending out of 19 with the budget office permission as well as SAO. Again, that is to run concurrent with those grant awards that were set up initially in BFY 19. We have swept in BFY 17, 1.3 million, BFY 15, 3.5 million, and BFY 13, $2.3 million. The issue comes in where I don't believe historically the sweeping was taking place on a fiscal year basis, only the biennial basis. So this is really to correct both our ability to adhere to what's written and requesting what's written be.
So going back to the amendment, why don't you remind us of what the amendment is?
Well, I never made the amendment.
Well, go ahead and make it.
Now.
Yeah, you did. You just didn't make it at the right time.
My motion would be that on page 2, after the period after revert on line 7, we delete the remainder of section 1A. So essentially, we delete the rest of that, lines 8 through 12.
Is there a second? I second.
Thank you.
Discussion.
So I mean, so what the effect of that is that you'll never reversion, you'll never have a sweep of any of this money. And so ultimately it'll either, I mean, it's not going to revert. So I guess they can continue to use it for grants, but that'll be a question you're always going to keep track of. You're going to always want to know how much money is available in the department for granting as you come in the biennium. And, if in the year that there's 12.3 million that's swept, if that's retained in there, you're most likely not going to end up with an appropriation for that year. So, I mean, the appropriation committee will watch it, but I don't know why you wouldn't just want to continue to have it swept with the unobligated, unexpended, obligated, have it swept and start with the clean slate every so often. I mean, this obviously goes on for several years before the obligated, the money, you know what the obligation is by the end of the biennium, but you don't know when you're going to actually send it out. So that's not going to change. So, you actually have it now where just this money just it doesn't revert. So it's just there. It accumulates. They may use it, they may not use it, but it will accumulate.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, it may accumulate. My assumption would then be, as it accumulates every 2 years, we will not reappropriate, we will not appropriate more funds. But I'm concerned about how they manage that account. And I just want to make it easier for them to manage it. I don't think the account will accrue such a balance that it concerns me.
Well,
And and looking at the presenters, they seem to agree with my presumption.
Go ahead, Robin.
Mr. Chairman, and the rest of this paragraph indicates that the money goes into the UI Trust Fund. We have historically had one of the most healthy trust funds in the country. And it seems to me using the funds or employment support funds where they're going directly to services for individuals is the better use of those funds as opposed to putting them into the UI Trust Fund, where again, they're gonna, it's nice to say we have this wonderful trust fund and it's been very beneficial to us these past couple of years, but these monies right now need to go to individuals, need to go to services out to our communities. So that was another impetus for us to bring this.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
can I get a little more detail on what the services are? I thought I heard training was the only one that I can recall. Give me an idea of the services that this goes to, if you could.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Holly McCamey Simone, Workforce Program Administrator. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold. I'll stay away. But our federal grants help with career services and especially with those who are dislocated workers and to support our employers. And our grants, especially during the pandemic, we've come very close to exhausting those. And we were the only workforce center in the nation that remained open. We also had PPE expenses and we had additional temps that we brought in to help provide those services as well. And so those are some of the things that we can use those employment support funds to help supplement those grants and keep our doors open and keep those services out to those dislocated workers.
Mr. Chairman, follow on.
Go ahead.
Does any portion of the workforce development training grant come out of this fund?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, no, that's a different fund. That's a fund that's interest off of the state UI Trust Fund, different fund.
So how do you account for the expenditures of the dollars in your budgeting process so we know and the state knows where the money goes?
Mr. Chairman, in terms of the budget book itself or the expenditures after the fact? So the revenue source code for that is the 5053 line item that you'll see in the budget book. And then our process within fiscal is those funds are set up as a rollover. So we can run a report on specific grants to see what the grant award amount was and the expenditures tied to that as a direct rollover. There's a code within the system that allows for that.
So just following up, so following up on Senator Kinski's question. So what I heard earlier was you said we use it for UI gaps and workforce services. So you explained the workforce services part. You were keeping stuff open. You had to move workers around because some offices, the staff was sick. So I remember from our discussion during the budget, how you manage that. So using some of it for those workforce services, but now you're talking about grants, which is not in-house workforce service expenses, but it's grants. And then also what UI gap expenditures are. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on what type of grants come out of this support fund, as well as when we say UI gap funding, what that entails.
Mr. Chairman, I'll start out and Holly can add to it. So for example, you've heard a lot about the WIOA funding, which is WIOA funding. And, the feds require that if there has to be a direct benefit to the grant to be able to charge to that grant. So in order for an individual to charge their time or to do an effort for a participant, they have to qualify for those funding. Assuming that we go ahead, that we have qualifying expenditures for that grant. Again, WIOA has dislocated worker, youth, and adult functions for that grant. The dislocated worker funding, obviously with the turn of events through COVID, that's where a lot of our funding is now spent through these workforce centers, and that's pretty minimally funded. So once we've exhausted those grants, these employment support funds then help to offset because the other grants wouldn't support those functionalities.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I can just say what I think I heard you just say. So from my perspective, what it was is there's a cost in your office, an overhead, if you would, to the grant, but the real cost to your office, you've got to administer those grants. And those grants sometimes allow a little bit of scrape off amount for administration, but that may not be enough to cover it. And so this then comes back and covers those employees for doing that. So what this really does is enables us to make sure we get those grants. And to the extent we can't offset the salaries of workforce services with what you're allowed to do as an administrative expense from the grant. Is that fair?
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly correct. We have a list of grants out on our website, and we have about 58 programs that we run within workforce services, and the majority of them are supported by these funds. Again, if someone were to walk into our workforce center and need career services, they would charge time, those benefits, any of that benefit would then go to the Wagner-Pizer grant. Well, once that grant is out of money, rather than turn folks away, we have these rollover funds, which then serve to support that program. And that's what we mean by rollover, is it just supplements that grant.
And then what's the UI gap stuff? When you have the UI gap? At least that's what I thought I heard. You said you used it for two things. The workforce services, which I think we just talked, I thought I heard you say you used it for UI gap funding, and I'm not sure. I don't know what exactly. I'm assuming that's a gap between UI and something, but I understand what that gap is.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we can use part of that ESF or employment support funds to cover things like enhancements to our systems or things like that we might need, any gaps that we see. Throughout the pandemic, we've gotten a lot of federal grants to administer and support those programs. So we haven't had to use a lot of the ESF funds, but we can if we need to.
That's the gap. All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
And just to clarify something that Robin just said, those ESF funds do help administratively, but also when our grants near the end of those, the ESF funds will go to direct client services in employment support and also vocational rehabilitation as well.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, please proceed.
So with respect to Representative Schwartz's proposed amendment, what would be an argument against it? I mean, it sounds like a pretty good idea to me.
I don't think there is.
Who made it?
Representative Schwartz.
Other than it was Andy. On principle.
Mr. Chairman, following that logic, in future, I will hand all my amendments to Mr. Stiff.
That didn't improve your position.
I'll tell you, House of Propes is a tough crowd to play.
Okay, any further discussion?
Well, no, that was actually a question. I'm serious. What is the argument against just doing what he said?
There really isn't, but I can see it.
Okay.
Okay, on the amendment, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion carries. Okay, as amended.
All the questions?
Roll call on the bill.
No, because we just took it all out.
We're just
done with.
Roll call, Don.
I'm following.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, the motion is on 22 LSO 0324, working draft 0.4 as amended. Representative Kinner.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Schwartz.
Aye.
Representative Simpson.
Aye.
Representative Stiff.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Senator Guru. Aye. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinski.
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz. Pro Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the bill has been adopted for sponsorship, House bill or Senate file.
I think that's a Senate file. We'll do it. Make it a House bill. We don't care. Andy, is that, you want to have this bill? You want to floor manage this bill? All right, there we go.
Mr. Chairman, one
Yes.
note, I do have a conforming change that you'll see in the title as well when that's sponsored.
Okay. Okay, Don, where are we?
Mr. Chairman, that concludes your agenda for today.
Yippee. Okay, any other business for the day? Just tell us tomorrow again.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, tomorrow's agenda kicks off with a presentation of the Craig report, followed by a consideration of two pieces of draft legislation, the investment of game and fish operating funds in Pool A, as well as the Department of Fire Protection and Electrical Safety fees. Following a break, one more piece of legislation regarding the state employees and officials group insurance premiums. And I think you got a preview of that with your discussion with Director Bach. And you'll close out the morning session with a callback from the Department of Health, followed closely by consideration of draft legislation with the professional licensing boards, the Department of Health, on the topic of Board of Psychology Behavior Analysts Regulation. In the afternoon, you have a callback with the, and likely we'll have a long lunch, unfortunately, because the last three items we have, two of them cannot be modified in terms of timing. You have a callback with a geologic survey at 2 p.m. So you have noon until 2 if you wanted to meet as groups or have errands or something. And then the 2:30 p.m. Governor's letters. And unfortunately, we can't change that.
Why not?
Because they indicated they were available to come up here with at 2 p.m. to discuss their.
Well, what if they're done with the letters earlier than they think?
We could move as quickly as they're
I
ready.
think they may be. So we ought to just follow up with that. Would you, Kev, or somebody? Yeah.
And finally, the judicial letters as well. And we've tried to move those up as well and have been unsuccessful in doing so.
Well, we can tell them what to do. Okay.
Chairman, that's a little bit different than the printout I've got. I just want to confirm. Take the 130 callback of DOH and the 145 draft legislation and move it till just before lunch. And then change geological survey to 2 p.m.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we were, in all sincerity, we were trying to get out of here on a Friday, and I recognize some travel plans as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, we have not been able to move items 38 and 39 on the current agenda. On the prior agenda, they were 34 and 35, governor's letters and judicial letters.
So then just walk us a little bit through Monday.
Mr. Chairman, this is certainly at the co-chair's discretion as to how you proceed, but under a typical budget markup scenario, Monday, we would entertain any global amendments, if you have any, and this fiscal environment is not the same as recent years. And then we would proceed through agency budgets. If you're going in consecutive order, I think you could make it through at least, agency 53 or so, workforce services. I recognize there may be some members that are not able to attend and would want their agencies pulled out for explanation or voting purposes. The next day, you would work through the second half of the budgets. And then on Wednesday, under a typical scenario, you would do state capital construction, followed by footnotes and section 300s. And then the ARPA legislation, which is new this year, and pending your desires, potentially a fourth bill on conserved or one-time general fund projects.
Go ahead.
Question for the chairs and Dawn. I know there's been a number of members submit bills for JAC consideration of sponsorship. When would we get to those?
We have time for tomorrow. We've got some time to look at some draft legislation. I think there was a bill that Senator Steinmetz had that we talked about that was about restraining the governor's authority to spend ARPA money.
That's being
So
drafted.
we wanted that. So we got, so that we're not forgetting about that. Was there any other bills that we had that
Yeah,
we?
Mr. Chairman, I'd sent one on the A&I bill as far as their authority to be able to make discretionary changes to EGI
Right,
without
right, yeah.
legislative approval. And then you've also got one where we've got a request from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department
To Pool A.
to allow them to move some of their investment or their funds that they do internally themselves. and
Pool A.
and move some- What's that? It is on the agenda. I didn't see it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may follow up to Senator Hicks's point, 2 of those 3 are scheduled tomorrow at 9 and 9:30.
Okay, I didn't see that. Thank you.
Or 9 and 10:15, excuse me. The Game and Fish bill and the EGI bill.
Okay.
All of your individual bills have been shared with the chairs. There is the Senate File 118 legislation. And the only reason we have not scheduled that, and we can certainly schedule that, is the language of it may depend on what you do in your ARPA bill. So we wanted to hold that back and have the discussion simultaneous with that.
Which makes sense. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I think what Don left as an open question was whether there would be a separate bill for the conserved ARPA. And I thought I heard the 2 co-chairs, I thought you did want that additional bill.
Well, we have, I think that we're saying the same thing. There's a bill that is going to basically direct what can and can't be done with ARPA for those funds that we don't appropriate. And how much we conserve, or basically don't allow it to be appropriated until we come back.
Correct.
We're
And
talking about the same thing.
I think Bob had and I think Don had a question mark at the end of it. Do we want such a bill?
No, I think we've directed him to do it.
Mr. Chairman, I think 2 separate issues. The Senate File 118 and the ARPA bill are both scheduled. I think the chairs have given pretty clear direction that that committee will discuss both of those next week. The outstanding question is whether or not there will be a one-time or conserved funds, general funds, not federal funds, not federal ARP funds. And that was the topic of Management Council's meeting in part Thursday morning of last week. And that's certainly the co-chairs and the committee's prerogative. From a staff perspective, it depends. I don't know what you're going to do with the governor's recommendations. Some of those can be, let me take an easy one. The Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund for $75,000 is a one-line amendment in a section 300. There are other programs or suggestions in there that arguably would not be suitable for a budget bill, meaning they need programmatic requirements, kind of like
Multiple page bills.
right.
Mr. Chairman, I think what is, I'm envisioning what we're going to take to the rest of the bodies. I think there's going to be multiple ways we're going to allocate the ARPA funds. One bill might be just the real easy ones, but I think we didn't need to produce a master sheet for our people to say, here's what we're going to do, and this is where you'll find that particular proposal, and then the total at the bottom, so they can see the big picture, even though it might be in many different sources.
Yeah, and I think what Don's getting to is that we don't know which one or all of we're going to do until we kind of do our markup of the budget and how we come out through with the ARPA dollars and how we segue it. We may do exactly that and we may not.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think the extenuating circumstances that this committee needs to be aware of is the schedule that was approved by management council last week. So typically we have 2 days to do the budget. Currently on the schedule, my recollection on, we have 1 day to do the entire budget. Now there's a flex day in there. Is that not correct, Don?
Mr. Chairman, all of the motions and management council were withdrawn.
Okay.
So the current schedule is a 5-day schedule with 2 days of the committee of the whole, 1 day for second reading, a day off on Thursday, and third reading. There are serious challenges with that, and potentially specifically on the Senate side, in that they would have several days of CAPCON bill, the ARPA bill, the budget bill, and I think there was at least some discussion of a couple of things. One, advancing the first portion of the committee of the whole to the Friday prior to the second week, or alternatively, as Senator Hicks noted, expediting committee of the whole to 1 day on Monday. Having said that, I think there was also some desire that the calendar would not be disjointed, at least for votes between the two houses, so that the House would not be on second reading when the Senate was on third.
When the co-chair and I talked about that yesterday, and so I agree that we have to keep that in mind, how we proceed and how complicated and how long and how many bills there are. So,
Well, Mr. Chairman, the other extenuating circumstance I think that this committee needs to be aware of is the redistricting bill, if there is a redistricting bill. And what the potential implications are on that.
yeah, exactly.
I honestly think that the cleaner that we can keep just the general budget in a bill and get that knocked out, is the longer, I'm really worried that if we put a lot into the 300 series, we're going to have hundreds of amendments coming all over the place. And I'd rather park that stuff, get through all the agency budgets, get that stuff knocked out and get it done before we get into what I would say, the more controversial and highly likely that there's going to be a lot of amendments. You know, I had asked, we on the Senate had put out, an idea for expenditures and conserve and stuff. And I'm just telling you, there's 100 ideas out there probably coming with some level of budget. So the more that we can keep those out of the budget onto another specific bill, the quicker we can deal with the budget. But that's just.
So specifically, I mean, you're talking about ARPA components to it.
Yeah, so keep the ARPA fund separate and keep the conserved. If there's big pots of money that we're talking about, keep that separate, keep that out of the regular budget. Because I think that's where we're going to see most of the amendments come.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to agree with my good friend across the room about the ARPA in particular, with a slightly different logic, in that I think it should be in a separate bill for purposes of transparency for the public, because otherwise, if we do part of the ARPA, as take for instance, a natural resource trust fund, it is a simple 300 section piece, but to separate that out from the rest of the ARPA then confuses everything. So I'm all for an ARPA bill. The conserved, I'm not 100% sure, but probably because that's, if we have that would be a whole other budget bill. I don't know how we manage it.
Mr. Chairman. So as to the conserved, it's whatever that number is, $400, $500 million. If that is available to budget in the budget, you're going to have a lot of people competing for that money, as opposed to, here's what we got for the budget. Let's pass the budget. Anybody looking for $100 million project, the other bill comes up on Wednesday when we go through the conserved general fund or the ARPA fund.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, because they're going to be grabbing for it no matter where it's at.
Mr. Chairman, and you're absolutely right. That's the reason to keep it out of the regular budget. Because here's my fear. If we get into this, we sit here and we know there's a significant amount of dollars that's available for saving or expenditures or for continuation. Not one time, not necessarily infrastructure and all these other things. I really worry about this dragging the entire budget process down. And people voting against the budget because they weren't able to take $300 million and stick it in this account, $50 million for this project. And so consequently, I think it adds a lot of potential unnecessary risk to the budget.
Well, the opposite could be true too. I mean, how do we know? Because because the one thing people need to do, they know they have to pass a budget. But I think we'll have a lot better idea as we work through the budget and the ARPA bills. I think this will all kind of play itself out next week when we do this.
All right, Mr. Chairman, but we can continue this discussion, but what I would like to do is everybody put $20 in a pot. And then we'll run a pool and you pick a number as to how many amendments that you think are going to come specific to those dollars, and whoever's closest wins the pool.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Co-Chair, just one more, at least in concept, if we could walk out with an understanding that we'd have a conserved funds bill, because I agree with you, you can't control what the floor does, but if you're trying to knock a budget through and somebody comes up with 300 million, 100 million, 50 million, an amendment into the budget, at least on the Senate side, we can say, look, folks, hold that for the conserved fund or the ARPA bill. Let's get this budget through. And I don't know about the House, but I think that would make sense. I think it would work on the Senate side and likely the House as well.
Okay, good enough. Anything else for the good of the order tonight? We will stand in recess till 8 o'clock.